Every autumn a man came down from the mountain and put the same question to each of us, one at a time, about who owned the gold above our heads. That was the whole tax. No coin. No grain. No sons taken for the wars we were not allowed to fight. You stood in your own doorway, you named the owner out loud, and the man moved on to the next door. He wrote nothing down. I want that understood from the start, because everything that happened to me later grew out of it. There was no book. There was never a book. The saying was the tax. His name was Hask. He had done the walk for 19 years, and he had the soft dead eyes of a man who has heard the same word from 10,000 mouths and stopped hearing it somewhere around the third thousand. I stood in my doorway on Sixpence Lane with my hands behind my back, because a man with nothing left should at least keep his hands still. Hask stopped in front of me. Around us, tallow smelled of wet ash and boiled turnip, the way it always smells in the last week of autumn, when the smoke sits low and no one has money for anything better. He put the question to me the way he put it to everyone. Who holds the mountain? Thessarian, the undivided. Hers is the gold above tallow, and tallow says so freely. You had to give the word freely. No one ever explained why, and every one of us gave it anyway, because our grandparents gave it, and there's, back past anything a person can check. Hask nodded and stepped to the next door, which was the Auburn house, and the widow gave the name in a voice like a hinge, and then wanted to know, at volume, whether the mountain intended to do anything at all about the price of turnips. Was it aware there was a price? Did it eat? Hask ignored her. Hask ignored everybody. He went on to the Prattle brothers, who gave it twice each because they have never in their lives agreed on when a thing is finished. I should have gone back inside. That was the entire correct move, and I have gone over it more times than I can count, and I still do not think I could have made myself do it. Because I had been counting the doors. It is closer to a disease than to a boast. For 11 years I ran a counting house at the top of this lane, the Vein, 4 rooms and a good iron box, and I discounted paper for wool men and salt men and anyone else who needed money in autumn and would have it in spring. Then I discounted more paper than I had silver behind it. One bad winter got worse, and 40 people came to my door on the same morning wanting what I had promised them. I paid 11 of them. The Vein closed. The iron box went to the Auburn widow, which is why she is allowed to shout whatever she likes at me for the rest of my life, and I have never once argued the point. What I kept was the disease. I count. I cannot stand in a market without pricing the market. I cannot watch a man walk down a lane without counting the doors he stops at. And I had counted this walk every autumn since I was 9 years old, sitting on the Vein step with my father, who counted it too and never once explained why. When I was a boy, the naming walk took 9 days. Hask finished Sixpence Lane before the bells. He would be done with all of tallow by supper, and he would still have light to climb home by. 9 days to 1 afternoon. Hask had not got faster. There were fewer doors, and at 11 of the doors on Kettle Row that morning, no one came out at all. I knew it was 11. I had counted 6 the year before, and 2 the year before that, and none at all when I was a boy, because when I was a boy there was no such thing as a house in tallow with nobody in it. So when Hask came back up the lane on his way to the low gate, I did the stupidest thing I have ever done, and I have done a great many stupid things, most of them with other people's money. I asked him whether anyone up the mountain had noticed that the walk had lost 8 days. Hask stopped. It was the first time in 19 years I had seen him stop for a reason that was not a door. He turned around slowly. Behind him the Prattle brothers went quiet, which for them is a kind of medical emergency, and the widow Auburn leaned so far out of her window that she was more outside her house than in it. Say that again. I have never learned when a thing has been heard enough. I said it again, and then, because the silence kept going and I have never been able to leave a silence alone, I filled it with the rest. 8 days of names gone in one lifetime. If the naming is worth anything at all to her, she is being paid 1/5 of what she was paid when I was a boy. Somebody up there should be counting that. Somebody up there is not. Hask hit me across the mouth with the back of his hand, which I had expected, and then he grabbed my collar, which I had not. Not a soul in tallow moved to help me. I want to be fair about that, because later I wanted a great deal from these people, and it matters that I knew exactly what I was asking. They did not move because I was the man who lost the Vein. They did not move because Hask came from the mountain. And they did not move because in tallow, when the mountain reaches down and takes something, you look at your boots and you are grateful it was not yours. The widow Auburn was the only one who spoke, and what she offered, at volume, was that if the mountain was going to eat me, it should first take out of me the 3 crowns I still owed her. Fair, I agreed, with a mouth already filling up. Ask for interest. Nobody ever asks for interest. Then Hask dragged me through the low gate and up the switchbacks toward Grieve, and Tallow got smaller behind me, and I remember thinking, with the strange flat calm of a man whose day has become impossible, that I finally had something to count that mattered. The climb took the rest of the afternoon. Grieve is not a mountain the way the hills west of us are mountains. Grieve is a wound in the ground with a mountain built over the top of it. The road up is old and wide and worn smooth, and nothing grows on it, and has not needed to for a very long time. Hask did not speak to me once. He walked ahead and let me follow, because there was nowhere to go and we both knew it, and because a man who talks to a prisoner has to think about him afterward. At the top there is a door in the rock that nobody built. It is a gap in the stone about as wide as a barn, and it goes down at an angle that makes your knees complain, and the air coming out of it is warm. That is the first thing they never warn you about. The mountain breathes warm. All my life I had assumed a dragon's hall would be cold, the way a cellar is cold, and instead it came up around me like the inside of a bakehouse and smelled faintly of hot coin. We went down for a long time. There were lamps in the wall, old ones, burning brightstone, which is a thing they cut out of the deep rock in which no human has ever been sold, and every 100 paces or so there was a shelf cut into the rock where somebody had once set a lamp and had not come back to trim it in a century. And then the passage opened, and I stopped, and Hask let me stop, because everybody stops. The gold of Grieve is not a pile. I had the word pile in my head from the stories, and the word is wrong, and I think the wrongness of it is the whole reason nobody in 10,000 years worked out what I worked out. It is a floor. It is a floor of coin and plate and cup and chain that runs out past the last lamp into the part they call the cradle, and it does not move, and it has not moved, and the dust lies on it in a smooth gray skin exactly the way dust lies on an unused road. I stood there with blood drying on my chin and I thought, clear as a bell, that I was looking at the largest dead thing in the world. Then a woman's voice from somewhere out in that dark wanted to know why Hask had brought her a man with a broken mouth, and I found out how little I knew about anything. She came into the lamplight and she was a woman. That is what I have to put down, because that is what my eyes did with her at the time. A tall woman in a plain dark dress, barefoot on her own gold, perhaps 50 years old, with gray coming in hard at the temples. I knew what she was. Everyone knows dragons wear our shape when it suits them. I had simply never seen it, because in Tallow the mountain does not visit, the mountain sends Hask. What I had never been warned about, and what I do not think anyone alive had bothered to think about, was how she stood. She stood like a person who was carrying something heavy and has been carrying it so long that she no longer shifts the weight. Hask went down on one knee and told her, in the flat voice of a man delivering a complaint about a neighbor's goat, that I had called the naming worth less than it used to be, and that I had done it in the street where people could hear. Thessarian the Undivided looked at me for what felt like a while. Up close her eyes were the only thing that did not fit the shape. They were the right color and the right size and they were set in her face correctly, and they were still not eyes that had ever belonged to a woman of 50. Do you know how old I am? 10,000 years. That is the number everybody gives. Everybody gives it because it is true. Now tell me the number you gave in the street. And there it was. That was the whole moment, and I felt it land the way you feel a floor give slightly under your foot. She had not wanted an explanation. She had not wanted my name. She wanted the number, first, before anything else, and she wanted it the way a man wants water. I have sat across a table from a great many people who were pretending not to want a thing. I made my living off the difference between what a man claims and what a man leans toward. She wanted the number. She had wanted it before I arrived. She had wanted it, I would guess, for about 300 years, and there had been nobody in her whole enormous life whose work it was to count anything. 9 days. When I was 9 years old the naming walk took 9 days. This morning your man finished Tallow before supper and had liked to climb home by. Hask put in something angry about how the walk goes faster because he knows the town. 19 years. I did not look at him while it came out. You have walked it 19 years. A man does not get 8 days faster at walking. Be quiet, Thessarian told him, and Hask went quiet, and it took me a moment to understand that she had meant Hask and not me. She came down off the gold and stood on the stone floor in front of me, and I had to look up, and she waited while I did it. Say the rest. What else did you count? 11 doors on Kettle Row did not open this morning. 6 last year. 2 the year before. There is no fever in Tallow and no war. Those houses are empty because the people in them went east to the Salt Road, where a man can be paid. And when a house is empty, Nobody in it says my name. Nobody in it says anything. She was quiet for a moment. I have collected the naming from tallow since before your language existed. It has never changed. Nothing about it has ever changed. Everything about it has changed. It has changed slowly, which is the only reason a person who lives forever would not notice. You have been getting poorer for 3 centuries, and you have been getting poorer at a speed that is invisible to anyone who does not write the numbers next to each other. I want you to understand that I was not being brave. I was being what I am, which is a man who cannot stop the arithmetic coming out of his mouth once it is started, and which is also the exact quality that lost me the vein. She stood very still. On the gold behind her, the dust lay smooth and gray all the way out to where the lamps failed. Then came the question that made the whole rest of my life, and it came quietly, with her chin down, in the voice of somebody checking a bruise. How would I know? If you are right, how would a person know it from the inside? And out came the thing I had been turning over the entire way up the mountain, and which I had promised myself I would not speak, because it was rude past the point of survival. You would have slipped. Not often. Once, twice in a century, at the end of a cold year. You would have been wearing this face and it would have come off you for a breath, in front of nobody, and you would have told yourself it was a trick of the lamps. The silence that came after that was different from the other silences. Hask made a small noise like a man watching a cart go off a bridge. Thessarian did not move at all for 4 seconds. I counted them, because I count, and because counting was the only thing keeping me upright. Then she informed me, in a perfectly ordinary voice, that no one had ever spoken to her that way and lived a full day afterward, and that she had a question first, and that after the question we would see. She wanted the years. I did not understand. When? You claim twice in a century. Give me the years. There was no possible way for me to know the years, and I made that clear. Then guess. Something in the room got warmer, and it was not the lamps. So I did what I do. I stood on the stone floor of the largest dead thing in the world, with my mouth still bleeding, and I built the number out loud in front of her, the way I used to build a discount for a wool man who was watching my hands for a trick. 3 bad winters in living memory. The one my father called the long gray, the one that took the Embry yard, and the one 9 years ago when the low gate froze shut and 11 families left in a single spring. After each of those, tallow was smaller by the following autumn. So if it ever came off you, it came off you in the second half of those 3 winters, and the worst of the 3 was 9 years ago, and it would have been the worst for you too. She turned her head slightly, the way a person does when a sound comes from a direction they were not watching. It was 9 years ago. In this hall. There was nobody here. And then, in a voice I do not think was meant to leave her own mouth, she put it down to grief, because a dragon called Breg had died that winter, and she had been the last of her kind to speak to it. I kept my mouth shut, which is the only genuinely intelligent thing I did that entire day. Because I was watching her hand. She had put it out to steady herself against the stone, which is a thing tall people do without noticing, and the hand on the stone was not a hand. It was only for a moment. Less than the 4 seconds I had counted before. The fingers went long and the color went out of them and the nails went into the rock about a knuckle deep, and there was a sound like a chair being dragged, and then it was a hand again, and there were 4 holes in the stone. She looked at them. She did not look at me. I understand now, though it took me another month to be sure, that I was watching the single most private thing that can happen to one of them, and that she would have killed any dragon alive for seeing it. What she did instead was take her hand off the wall, and fold both hands together in front of her, and stand there being a woman of 50 with gray at the temples for a long, long moment. Get up, she told Hask, who had not been kneeling for some time. Go back down and finish the walk. Hask started to point out that it was finished. I know. That is the point. Walk it again tomorrow and count the doors that do not open, and bring me the number, and if the number is not 11, bring me your reason. Hask went. He went past me without a glance, and I have thought about that, because in one afternoon I had gone from a man he could hit to a man whose number he had to go and check. That is a promotion of a sort. It did not feel like one at the time. At the time I was alone in a warm room with a creature who had just been humiliated in front of exactly one witness, and I was the witness. Thessarian walked back up onto her gold. She did it barefoot and without looking down, the way you cross your own kitchen in the dark. Then she sat, halfway out into the lamplight, on a slope of coin that must have been worth more than every building in Tallow together, and she looked at me with those wrong eyes. You are a counting man. Tallow had a counting house. It failed. It did. Why? I promised more silver than I was holding. And then everyone came for it on the same morning. She thought about that for a while, and I let her, because I had no other goods to sell and because my legs had started to shake now that there was time for them to. How many came? 40. I paid 11. And the other 29? Are still owed. Some of them are in this town. One of them is a widow who shouted at your collector this morning about turnips and about me, in that order, and she was right on both counts. The Syrian did something with her mouth that lived in the same family as a smile. Then she laid out the shape of the rest of my life, and she laid it out the way she seemed to handle everything, without any weight on it at all, as though the words were about weather in a country she did not live in. You have 30 days. In 30 days you will show me that the naming can be made to grow, and that a man can make it grow, and that it can be made to grow by more than the 8 days it is lost. And if I cannot? Then you will have been wrong in my hall. She said it kindly, which was much worse. And what am I to do it with? Nothing. If I give you gold, I have given away a claim on gold, and I will not do that, and you do not yet know enough to understand why, and I am not going to teach you. Then she lay back on her coins like a woman lying down in long grass, and she closed her eyes, and she gave me one more thing, and it was the only warm thing she gave me for a very long time. Do not come back to tell me it is impossible. Everyone comes to me with impossible. Nobody has ever brought me a number. They let me walk out of the mountain on my own legs, which surprised me, and then I understood that of course they did. A man with 30 days is not a prisoner. A man with 30 days is an investment no one has to feed. I slept in the vein that night. It has no furniture and half a roof, and I keep the key because no one else wants it, and I lay on the boards doing the only thing I know how to do. The problem, stated plainly, was this. I had to make more people say her name, and I had nothing to pay them with, and the town that would have to give it was leaving. I could not fetch back the 11 families on Kettle Row. They were down at Carrow on the Salt Road being paid in actual coin, and no argument of mine was going to beat being paid. So the names would have to come from somewhere that was not tallow, which meant I needed to know something I had never in my life needed to know, which was what the naming actually does. I had given it every autumn since I could talk. No one had ever explained what it was for. That is not unusual. Nobody in tallow can tell you what a wheel is for either, past the bit where the cart moves. The next morning I went east, to the scree. Everyone in tallow knows about the scree the way you know about a bad ford. It is the broken country under the shoulder of Grieve, where the mountain has been shedding itself for longer than anyone counts, and it is where the dragons live who have nothing. We are taught to stay off it. The danger is real enough. What actually keeps us off it is the winnowing, which comes every ninth spring and takes them, and because no one wants to be standing in the middle of somebody else's law when it arrives. I went anyway, and I want to be honest about why. It was not compassion. It was that I had spent the whole night looking for anyone in the world who might have something to give away and no reason to keep it. The scree at mid-morning is loud. The stories leave that out entirely. There were perhaps 30 of them within sight of where I stopped, and they were arguing. They were arguing about a goat. The goat was called Winter, and by the end of that year I would owe Winter more than I owed most people. None of them wore our shape. I did not know yet that they could not, and so I stood there for a while wondering why creatures who could be men were choosing to lie on hot rock like enormous unhappy dogs. The nearest one noticed me and came down off his stone in 3 moves, and I found out that a dragon the size of a hay cart can be extremely quiet when it wants to be, and that this is much worse than the noise. He put his head down level with mine. Up close the scale on him was dull, almost chalky, and there were patches on his flank where it had gone thin and gray the way a dog goes gray at the muzzle, except that he was young. Are you lost, or are you food? He put it in perfectly good speech, in the tone of a boy checking which chore he has been handed, and I discovered that my legs still worked, which was useful information. Neither. I am here to buy something. That got their attention in a way I have not managed to get anyone's attention before or since. The arguing stopped. The goat, which I now saw was already dead and had been the subject rather than a participant, was set down with some care. There is nothing here to buy. Look at us. We are what is left when there is nothing to buy. His name was Kell. He gave me that immediately and without being invited, which I would learn is simply what he does, and he was 14 years old, which in their reckoning is somewhere around a boy of 11 with the body of a warhorse. Behind him an older one, a grey female with a cracked crest who turned out to be called Umber, put in that if the human had come to look at the poor, he should at least have brought bread. And a smaller one, Tak, who I would come to like a great deal and who had the manners of a tavern, wanted to know whether human males were built the way the stories claim, because he had heard a thing about us that he refused to believe without evidence. How much of that is true? And how much of it do you actually use? Tak was not getting that settled on an empty stomach. Tak informed me that the argument had been running 60 years, that the bet now stood at 4 goats, and that if I did not settle it, Umber would go on claiming she was right on the grounds that no one had ever proved her wrong. Umber said that she was right. I mention this because it was the first time in 2 days that anybody had made me laugh, and because I have noticed that people who are frightened of dragons have never once considered that a creature with 1,000 years of life is going to spend a fair amount of it being extremely coarse about the neighbors. Then I asked Kel why none of them were wearing our shape, and the scree went quiet in a completely different way, and I understood that I had walked straight into it. Because we cannot. He gave it the way a boy gives a thing he has decided not to be ashamed of yet. Then he explained it to me, standing on hot rock with his chin down, and he explained it clearly, because he is the most literal creature I have ever met and it has never once occurred to him to soften anything. The shape costs. It is not a trick. It runs off what you hold, and what you hold is gold that somebody else says is yours. I made him repeat it, and he did, patiently, and then a third time, and by the third time my hands had gone cold. Gold that somebody else says is yours. Not gold, not the weight of it, not the shine, not the having. The saying. The floor of coin under Thessarian is a floor of coin, and what holds her together is a town full of people standing in doorways every autumn with their mouths open. And what happens if you simply take gold? If you find it, or dig it, or kill for it? Nothing happens. That is the first thing any of us learns. Taken gold is dead metal. There is no voice on it. And then he did the thing that ended the argument in my head forever. He went up the slope, moved a flat stone with his nose, and came back and put 3 coins down in front of me on the rock. He had found them in a wash below the tooth, 4 years ago. He had kept them ever since. They had been dead metal for 4 years, and he had known perfectly well that they would be, and he had kept them anyway, the way you keep a thing that ought to work. Nobody will say they are mine. Umber will not, because saying it costs her. Tak will not, because he has less than I do and it would be worse for him. And the ones with hoards do not come down here. Why would saying it cost her? Because whatever I hold, I hold. And Umber and I are on the same rock with 1 goat. There it was, 10,000 years of dragons sitting on 10,000 years of gold, and not one of them able to make the gold work, because the only mouths that could do it belonged to their competitors. They had built a world where the single most valuable thing in it was a sentence, and where every creature capable of saying that sentence had a reason not to. Except us. We say it every autumn, for nothing, in a doorway, and we have been doing it so long that we think of it as a tax. I sat down on the rock. I remember Tak putting his head round in front of mine. Are you ill? What I was doing was arithmetic, and it was the good kind, the kind that comes out clean the first time, and I have had perhaps 4 of those in my life. A hoard cannot be divided. Thessarian cannot give away 1 coin, because a coin given is a claim given, and a claim given is a piece of her own lung handed to a rival. That is why the floor of Grieve has dust on it. That is why it has always had dust on it. But the saying can be divided. The saying is not a lump. Any mouth will do, and there are always more mouths, and the mouths on the scree belong to creatures with nothing to protect and therefore no reason to keep them shut. Kel had 3 dead coins and no voice on them. Thessarian had a floor of coin and a town that was running out of voices. I looked at the 3 coins on the rock, and I did the only experiment available to me, and I did it without asking permission, because I have never been good at asking permission. Those are Kel's. He found them under the tooth and he has kept them 4 years and they are his, and I say so freely. Nothing happened for about 2 heartbeats. Then the smallest claw on his left forefoot, the outside one, went smooth and pale and shortened into something that was very nearly a nail, and stayed that way, and every dragon on that slope came up off the rock at once. Umber got to me first. She did not hurt me. She put her head down and looked at my mouth from about a hand away, the way you look into a lamp to see whether it is really lit. Say it again. Slower. What exactly did you name? I have found that I am at my best when I am too frightened to be clever, and what came out then is the only sentence from that whole month I would keep if I were allowed to keep one. I will say it as often as you like. But not for nothing, and not for a goat. I want to talk about what it is worth, and I want to do it before somebody up that mountain works out that it is worth anything at all. On the third day I climbed Grieve again, and this time nobody dragged me. Hask was standing in the gap in the rock with his arms folded, and he had the face of a man who has been given an instruction he does not enjoy. He stood aside. He did it slowly, and he did it, and I went past him into the warm. I have thought since about how much of what came later was built on that one small unpleasant moment. A man who has hit you and then has to let you through a door is a man with a permanent opinion about you. Thessarian was not on the gold. She was standing at the edge of it with her back to me, doing what I would eventually understand she does most of the time, which is stand still in an enormous room and let 10,000 years go past. I have a number for you. I need 100 coins. She turned around, and I want to be exact about this, because everyone imagines a dragon refusing you as a great roaring event. She looked at me the way a woman looks at a child who has asked for the moon on a stick, and she was almost gentle about it. Then she explained why the answer was no, and in explaining it she taught me more in 4 sentences than I had learned in 3 days of guessing. The gold is not the point. Everything you see on this floor is worth exactly what is said about it, and what is said about it is that it is mine. If I hand you a coin, I have not handed you metal. I have handed you the part of the world that calls that metal mine, and whoever holds it after that holds a piece of me. And if you simply gave one to a beggar who could never threaten you, then the beggar is stronger and I am weaker by 1 coin's worth of saying, and one day the beggar dies, and the coin passes to whoever is standing nearest, and now some creature I have never met is holding a piece of my lungs. That is why the dust is on it. 10,000 years of the most powerful things alive, sitting still, because the only safe move on the board is to make no move at all. So I put the thing to her the way I used to put it to Woolman, which is to agree with every word they have said and then move the wall 2 feet to the left. I am not asking you to give a coin away. I am asking you to put 100 of them into the hands of somebody who cannot hold a piece of you, because he cannot hold a piece of anything. She went very still. Explain that. What do I hold, in your opinion? I have no hoard. I have no shape to keep up and no fire in me and no mana to hold together. Gold does not do a single thing for me except buy bread. If 100 coins sit in my box, they are still yours, because there is nobody in the arrangement for them to become. I could see her turning it. It is a strange feeling, watching something that old think about something new, and the closest thing I can compare it to is watching a very large door that has been shut for a century move about an inch. Then she tested me, and it was the cleverest thing anyone did to me that entire year. She reached down without looking, took up a double handful of coin, and held it out to me. Not 100. 1,000, perhaps more. She held it out the way you offer feed to a horse. Take it. It is yours. I say so freely. And I understood, from the flatness of her voice, that if my hands had come up I would have died in that room, and that she would not even have been angry about it. She would have been disappointed, and then she would have gone back to standing still. No. Why? Because the moment I own gold, I am somebody. And the whole use of me is that I am no one. If you want a man to hold your right for you, he has to be a man who cannot pick up a right of his own without dropping yours. Her hands opened and the coins went back onto the floor, and the sound they made was the sound of an entire hillside of small change, and it went on for a long time. Then she wanted the real answer, and I gave her that too, because I have found that people who can smell one lie can usually smell the second one as well. I had money once. 4 rooms and an iron box and my name on the lane. It did not make me happy for one single day. What I want is a thing that keeps working after I am dead, and a man who owns something cannot build that, because everything he owns dies with him and gets fought over. She set the terms herself, which I would learn is simply how she does business. She does not haggle, she states, and then she waits to see whether you are still standing. 100 coins. They stay mine, and they are never called anything else. I want the count in my own body inside 20 days, and if I do not feel it, you bring the 100 back to this room and we will discuss the rest of your life. And one more thing. You will never take a coin from me for yourself. Not a fee, not a wage, not a gift. If you do, we are finished, and I will be the one to finish it. I have been given terms by some hard men in my time. She was the first person ever to hand me an arrangement in which the only thing I was forbidden was profit, and I am aware of how that sounds, and I took it anyway, and I have never once regretted the shape of it. The coins went down the mountain in a grain sack. It is the least dignified thing that has ever happened to 100 pieces of dragon gold, and has carried it, which improved my week considerably. Now, 100 coins in a sack is 100 coins in a sack. What I needed was 100 things that were not coins, and for that I needed the only person in Tallow who owns a die and a hammer. Doran keeps the foundry at the bottom of Kettle Row, in a yard her grandmother Sella worked before her, and the first thing she did when I came through her gate was put down her tongs and laugh at me for a while. She is about my age. Her forearms are a map of every year she has spent doing this, and she has the mouth you get from 20 years of being the only woman in a trade full of men who all thought they were the first to have that thought. The Vane. The man who ate this street's savings, and now you are standing in my yard with a sack. What is in the sack, Merrick? Because I would not take it if it was full of my own teeth. I went through the whole of it, what was in the sack and where it had come from. Then she stopped laughing, and out came a thing about dragon gold that I have never forgotten, and which she meant absolutely literally. I will melt it. I will strike it. I will not hold it. Not one piece of it goes in my hand, not for a heartbeat. You put it on the block, and you take it off the block, and my hands never touch it, and if you cannot agree to that you can go and find a smith who does not know what that metal is. Why? Because it belongs to something that is still alive and remembers, and then she spat into her own slack tub, which I would learn is what she does instead of finishing a sentence she does not want to finish. Her price was 3 crowns for the striking and 2 more for the die, and she wanted all of it in advance, and when I opened my mouth to negotiate she pointed at me with the tongs and reminded me, without any particular cruelty, that everyone in this town had already lent me money once. So I sold my father's coat to Tib the cooper, and the Vane's lock with it, and paid her the 5 crowns, and I want the record to show that the entire banking trade in this world began with a man selling a door lock. We argued about the mark for most of an afternoon. She wanted a face, because a face is hard to cut. I wanted something a person could feel with a thumb in the dark, and something that meant something, because a mark that means something is a mark people repeat. So we cut 9 strokes, 9 short lines in a fan, for the 9 days the naming walk used to take when I was a boy, which is the only fact in my life I have ever been completely certain of. Doran thought this was sentimental. She cut it anyway, and she cut it deep, and then she did the thing that made her rich later and nearly killed us both, which was to cut a second die exactly like the first, call it the sister, and keep it in her own pocket in case somebody stole mine. By evening on the 5th day there were 100 small gold pieces on her block, each one bearing 9 strokes, and each one of them meaning the same short sentence. The bearer of this may have 1 coin of grieve, held by Merrick of the Vane, who owns nothing. We called them claims because that was the word I had used in front of her without thinking, and because the shorter word is always the one that sticks. I carried them to the scree on the 6th day in a bread bag, and I have never been so frightened of anything in my life as I was of that walk, because I have been robbed twice in Tallow and this was the first time in a year I was worth robbing. I will tell you exactly how the first one went, because it was the last simple thing that ever happened to me. Kell came down off his rock. I put 1 claim on the flat stone in front of him. I went through what it was and what it was worth and what it was not, and he made me repeat the part about what it was not, twice, because he is Kell. You do not have the coin. The coin is in a box in Tallow. The coin is in a box in Tallow, I agreed. This is the right to it. The right is what you hold. And what do you want for it? I want you to name the gold of Grievous Thessarians, freely, out loud, once a day, for as long as you hold this. There was a long pause on that slope, and about 30 large heads came round to watch, and I understood that I had just asked a starving creature to praise the richest one alive. Umber put it plainly from the back. So the poor are to spend their mornings telling the mountain how magnificent it is, and for that we get a token that is not even the money. Yes. And in a year you will have something and she will have something, and right now you have a goat. Can I do it asleep? That was talk, and he was serious. He could try it and see whether it counted. He tried it for 9 days and it did not count, and he has never let me forget that I did not simply tell him no. Kell picked the claim up in his teeth, because he had no other way to pick anything up. Then he put it down and gave the naming, in a clear voice, in front of everyone, and he was the first creature on that slope to do it. Dag took 2 and gave the naming from the top of the heap where the whole valley could hear him. Sarn, who is older than Umber and says perhaps 9 words a year, took 1 and gave it in a whisper, and it counted exactly the same, which told me something useful about the rule. By the 9th day, 91 of the 100 were out. By the 11th, the count in Tallow started to be strange, because Hask came down the mountain out of season and walked Kettle Row with an expression I can only describe as offended. He had been sent to check the number, and the number had gone up. For the first time in 300 years, the naming of Grieve was worth more in the autumn than it had been in the spring, and it had been done by 9 dozen starving creatures on a rock heap and a man with no coat. And there was one other thing, and I noticed it, and I filed it in the wrong place, and it cost me a great deal later. Kel's second claw had changed. The metal was in an iron box in tallow. He had never touched it. All he held was a small stamped disc that promised him something he could not reach, and his body had begun, very slightly, to believe it. I decided it was my own doing. I had spoken his 3 coins into being his, that first morning on the rock, and I told myself that was still working. It was a reasonable explanation. It was even nearly true. It was also the single most important thing anyone had seen in 10,000 years, and I walked past it because I was in a hurry, and because I had 19 days left. For days after that, a second dragon came down the road to Tallow, and he did not come quietly, and he came in the shape of a man. I had never seen one of them wear our shape outside the mountain. The whole town came out for it. He walked in through the low gate at noon in a fur coat with the collar up, an enormous cheerful ruin of an old man, perhaps 70, built like a barrel that had been left out in the weather. His name was Vask, his mountain was Kern, 2 valleys east, and he had heard, in the way that they hear things, that a human in Tallow was in the business of making the poor say people's names. He drank first at the split ladle, or he tried to pay with a gold cup and was told by the potman to bring proper money like everyone else, which is the single most Tallow thing that has ever happened. Then he found me in Doran's yard. He looked at the die, at the block, at me, and then he laughed so hard that he had to sit down on a barrel, and the barrel expressed an opinion about it. Vask talked without stopping for about a quarter of an hour. He talked about his hoard, and about the winter of some year I had never heard of, and about a female 2 mountains over called Urin who was young and rising and whom he wished a number of specific misfortunes. Then he informed the yard at large, at volume, that the best thing about wearing our shape was that everything worked, and that he had spent his first 50 years in it doing very little else, and he provided details. Doran put down her hammer and gave him 2 full minutes on what she thought of men who described their own anatomy in a working yard, ending with an observation about the fur coat that I will not repeat and have never bettered. Vask enjoyed that more than anything else that happened to him that day. I think it was the first time in 400 years anybody had spoken to him as though he were merely a nuisance. Then he got to it. He wanted what Thessarian had. Not 100 coins. 2,000. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I have had 9 years to invent a better version and I have never managed it. He named the number, and I did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had no opinion at all about Thessarian, because a dragon's gold buys his own name and no one else's. What it said was that 2,000 claims put the whole heap to work instead of one slope, and that a house with 2 clients is a house, while a house with 1 client is a favor. I had 5 days before the mountain expected to feel something, and 15 before it expected an answer. I put 2 questions to him. Where is the gold, and is it yours? He answered the first honestly and the second loudly, and there is a difference between those 2 things, and I heard the difference, and I took the deposit anyway. I have gone back to that moment more often than to any other. Not because I did not see it. I saw it. I stood in Doran's yard and I thought, in as many words, that I did not have the 14 days it would take to walk 2 valleys east and ask the neighbors. And Doran, who was standing 4 feet away with a hammer, put it down long enough to remark that the coat smelled of a dead house. I gave her the number of days I had. 5 days is a reason and not an excuse, she said, and then she went back to her fire, and she was right, and it was the last time she bothered to warn me about anything for free. The 2,000 came over in 3 cart trips across 2 nights. Doran struck them into claims in 4 days flat, and I was so pleased with the speed of it that I did not stop once to look at what I was holding. Here is what I was holding. About 600 of those coins had come out of a hoard on a mountain called the Larn, whose owner had been a dragon named Breg, and Breg had died 9 winters ago in the same cold that emptied the Ember yard. He had died without kin. Vask had gone over the ridge and taken what was there, which every dragon alive would tell you is not stealing, because you cannot steal from the dead. And that is worse than stealing. Taken gold as dead metal, and dead metal cannot be named, and a claim struck on a dead coin is a beautiful little gold disc that promises exactly nothing. 600 of them went out onto the scree over 2 days, because the scree was where my customers were. Umber took 11. She had been the last one on that slope to come to me, because she is old and has been disappointed by more centuries than I have had months. She came in the end because Kel's foreleg had gone from claw to hand, 1 finger at a time, in front of everybody, and there is no argument in the world stronger than that. She gave the naming for 11 days. She gave it properly, out loud, every morning, in a voice that could be heard across the whole heap, because if Umber is going to do a humiliating thing she is going to do it where everyone can see her not being ashamed. And on the 12th morning she was exactly what she had been on the first. Not one scale. Not one claw. I was there when she worked it out. I had come up with the second batch, and she was sitting with her chin on the rock, and she looked at me for a while before she spoke. You sold me a stone. Behind her, 40 of them were doing the same arithmetic at the same time, and the scree is loud, and the scree went quiet, and I would like to report that something worthy of the moment came out of me. What I actually did was ask her, in a completely steady voice, to show me the 11, and then I sat down on a hot rock with the dead claims in my lap and started to count. 11 claims. 11 mornings of an old female standing on a rock heap praising a fat stranger in a fur coat. Nothing on the other side of it. Not for her, and, as it turned out, not for him either. Because that was the piece I had not thought through, and it took me until the middle of that night to get to it. If a coin is dead, then naming its owner is naming him Lord of Nothing, and the words go out of 40 mouths and land on the floor. Vask had bought 2,000 mornings of praise and was receiving, by weight, the same amount of mana he would have got from silence. The one thing keeping him from noticing was that a dragon who has just spent a fortune does not sit down at once and check whether he feels better. So on the 15th night I sat in the vein with a candle and 48 dead discs, and I made the only genuinely correct decision of that entire month. I could go to the scree with the truth, which was that I had been sold poison metal and that their claims were worth their weight and no more. That is the honest move. It is also the move that ends the house in its first month, because a house that says sorry once is a house that everyone tests. Or I could buy them back. Not at what they were worth, which was nothing. Add more than face. 13 good claims for 11 dead ones, paid to every creature on that heap who was holding one, and no argument and no delay. The second one is not more honest. I want to be plain about that, because I have heard the story repeated kindly since. It is the move that protects the house and lets the man who made the error stay standing. The only defense I will offer is that a house is worth protecting, and that I paid for it out of the one thing I actually had, which was every future I owned. I did not have 13 good claims. I did not have one. Everything I was holding was either Thessarian's 100, which was spoken for, or Vask's poison, which is how I came to be standing in Doran's yard at 4 in the morning, offering a woman who had already worked out exactly what I was going to do a deal she had already priced. She has gold. Every foundry has gold. 40 years of sweepings, 3 generations of scrap, broach backs and broken chain, and the fine dust you get off the floor of a yard where people have been melting things since her grandmother's time. It is human gold. Nobody took it off a corpse on a mountain. Every piece of it came into that yard in daylight from a person who wanted a pot mended, and that is worth more than all of Bregg's hoard put together. She heard me out. She let me finish. Then she named her price, and she named it in one sentence, and she did not move the die. Not a copy. Mine. Do you want to hear the rest, or is that enough? I hold it, I strike everything, and no claim exists in this world that I did not make. That makes you the house. That is correct. We stood in the dark yard for a while. I remember the fire noise and the smell and how tired I was and how completely she had me, and I remember thinking that in all my years at the vein I had never once met anyone who could do that to me in a single move. I could have said no. It is important to me that I put that down. I could have gone up that heap with the truth and eaten the month. I gave her the die, and the 5th part of every future striking, and the right to refuse any metal she did not like the smell of, which she would go on to use in ways I did not enjoy at all. That is how the house got a second owner in its 4th week, and how a woman who would not touch dragon gold with her hands ended up holding the only thing in the world that made dragon gold work. We melted her sweepings for 2 days. It came out to about 900 coins worth, which is a fortune in tallow and a rounding error on grieve, and it was enough. 13 for 11, paid on the scree, in front of everybody, starting with Umber. I did the whole thing myself, and I did it standing up. She watched me count them out onto the rock, and when it was done she put one question to me, and it was not the one I was braced for. Not why. Not how. How do you stop this happening again? And that is the moment the second rule of the house got made, and Umber made it, not me. Because I had no answer. Something came out of me about walking the valleys and asking neighbors, and she cut me off before I got to the end of it. You cannot tell. You are a man. You could stand in the middle of the Larn Hoard and feel nothing at all. I can tell from a foot away. Every one of us can. Dead metal is dead the way meat is dead. You know before you touch it. So why, in 10,000 years, had no one ever been asked to do it? Because we would have to hold another's gold to do it, and no one with a hoard will hold another's gold, and no one without a hoard was ever worth asking. Then she put her head down level with mine, the way she does, and she offered me the arrangement herself, and she made me pay for it, which I respected enormously. Every coin that comes into your box, I check. Nothing gets struck that I have not put my face over. And you pay me for it, and you pay me whether the metal is good or bad, because the day you pay me only for approvals is the day I start approving. She is, I think, the most naturally gifted businesswoman I have ever met, and she had spent 400 years on a rock arguing about a goat. So the house got a nose. Every deposit from that week onward went past Umber before it went near Doran's block, and between the two of them I ended up in the ridiculous position of a man who has founded a business in which he personally is not allowed to touch either the money or the tools. I have thought about that a great deal since. At the time it felt like humiliation. It was actually the only reason the thing survived what came later. That left Vask. I went east along the ridgeway on the 21st day with Hask, of all people, for company, because Thessarian had decided that a man carrying her name into another mountain would not be walking alone, and because I suspect she wanted a witness she could question afterward. Vask received us in the shape of the old man, in a hall that was smaller than Grieve and much noisier, and he had a fire going and roast birds on it, and he was pleased to see me until I opened my mouth. I gave him back 1,400 coins, and the 600 out of the larn were coming back on carts, and that the house would not hold them and would not strike them. He did not roar. I had been braced for roaring the entire 2 days of that road, and instead he sat there with a bird in his hand and got quieter and quieter, which I would learn is what they actually do. Are you calling me a thief? No. Breg is dead and the law says you may take what he left. I am telling you the metal does not work. You can have the law and the coins. You cannot have both the coins and the naming, because there is no naming in them. Then prove it. How does a man prove a thing like that in my own hall? And this is the only part of that trip I enjoyed. I had brought Umber. She had walked 2 valleys in her own shape, at night, on a road where a hoardless one has no business being, and she had done it because I paid her to and because I think she wanted to stand in a hall. She went along his floor with her head down. She named the live coin and the dead coin as she went, out loud, in a hall belonging to a dragon 4 times her size, and she got it right every single time, and by the end of it Vask had stopped eating. 611. That was her number at the end of it, and not 600. He had 11 more of his own in there from somewhere he did not want to discuss. We left with that number hanging in the room. At the door, in the pleasant voice of a man remarking on the weather, he let me know that he had enjoyed our arrangement and was sorry it was over. Then he wanted the other number. How many people know about my 11? 3 of us, and none of the 3 has any reason to sell it. That was a great comfort, and he repeated it twice. And on the road down Hask, who had not spoken since the ridge, remarked that in 19 years of carrying messages between mountains he had never once heard one of them ask how many people knew a thing unless he was already counting the cost of each one. That was the 23rd day. I came back into Tala with 7 days left, 100 coins of Grieve still working, 900 of Doran's sweepings converted into other people's rescue, a nose on the scree who was going to invoice me monthly, no fee, no wage, no coat, and a hoard holder 2 valleys east who now knew that a starving old female could walk into any hall in the world and tell the truth about its floor. The count on Grieve was up. That was the only column that had gone the right way, and it was the only one that mattered, and I remember standing at the low gate at dusk and doing the arithmetic 4 times because I did not believe it. Then I went up the mountain to be paid, which is a sentence that in every other trade means something pleasant. She was standing at the bottom of the passage when I came down, which had never happened before, and it told me the answer to the question before I asked it. Whatever a person carries when they are carrying 10,000 years, she had put some of it down. It was in the shoulders. She stood the way you stand when the weight has been shifted rather than removed. You did it. 91 on the heap and 11 more since. Every one of them naming Grieve out loud each morning. Your 100 coins are in an iron box in tallow and not one of them has moved. Then she did a thing that I found more unsettling than anything she had done in that hall so far. She held up her own hand in the lamplight and turned it over, slowly, front and back, and looked at it like a woman checking a mended pot for the crack. It holds. For how long does it hold? And then, because she is what she is, she was finished with being pleased inside about 4 heartbeats, and she wanted the rest. Because she had done her own arithmetic in those 30 days, and hers had a term in it that mine did not. Mine said the count was rising. Hers said the count was rising and it was rising through a man in a town at the bottom of her own mountain. I have not needed anyone for 10,000 years. Now my hand holds because a starving female on a rock heap says a sentence every morning, and she says it because of you. I did not answer that, because there was no answer that did not make it worse. So we came to it. I wanted the reserve. Not 100 coins. All of it, or as much of it as the world could carry, because 100 coins had bought 100 mouths and there are 900 more on that heap and 11 towns along the Saltway, Marrow Ford and Ashland and Cobb's Reach and 8 more, with no one in them doing anything useful at all. 9,000. That is what is countable on this floor. 9,000 claims. I stood there and let the number come apart in my head into the things it actually was, which is what a number is for. 9,000 mouths, or 5,000 mouths and the rest in reserve. Every dragon on the scree in our shape inside 2 years. Vask's mountain looking small. A town that stops emptying. And under all of it, one crack, and I saw it, and I put it in front of her, because she was going to find it in 9 days anyway, and I have never met anyone worse to be caught out by. If the house fails, your 9,000 does not come home. It is scattered across 1,000 holders in the shape of promises, and I am one man, and I am not hard to kill and not hard to ruin. You would not lose gold. Gold does not go anywhere. You would lose the saying, all at once, in 1 week. And what do you propose to do about that? Nothing. I cannot do anything about it. I own nothing and I am forbidden to own anything, and a man who owns nothing cannot stand behind a promise. There is a particular silence that happens in a negotiation when both parties have arrived at the same wall from opposite sides. It is the most honest moment in the trade and almost nobody enjoys it. So one of us has to stand behind it. Yes. And who else is there? And you are telling me that it has to be me. I am telling you there is no third person in this room. She walked out onto her gold. She did it barefoot and without looking down, the way she does, and she went a fair way out, until she was more shape than woman in the lamplight, and she was gone long enough that Hask, at the passage mouth, started shifting his feet. Here is what she was deciding, and I want it set down plainly, because it has been repeated since as though she was tricked and she was not tricked. If the house was to hold 9,000 of her coins, and the world was to trust the little stamp discs those coins produced, then somebody had to promise that the discs were good, and the only promise in existence large enough to cover 9,000 claims was the mountain itself. She would have to say, out loud and freely, that her own right to grieve stood behind my mark. That if the house could not pay, she would. Not gold. She was not giving gold. She was giving the one thing dragons never give, which is the position of standing second in a queue. When she came back she asked me 2 questions and they were both good ones. What does it cost me if the house never fails? Nothing, not 1 coin. It is a promise about a day that does not come. And if it does come? Then your right answers for it before anyone else's. Every claim in the world gets paid out of grieve, and there is no order in which you are paid first, because that is the whole point of standing behind a thing. She thought about that for perhaps a minute. I have watched a great many people make a great many bad decisions across a table, and I will tell you the tell, which is that they never argue about the bad part. They argue about the size of the good part and they treat the bad part as weather. She never once argued about the failure. She argued about the number of claims. Because in her head, and she put it in words, a dragon does not go bankrupt. Grieve had been standing since before the Saltway had a name. Towns fail. Men fail. Mountains do not. I could have made her look at it properly. That is the honest shape of that morning and I have not found a way to soften it in 9 years. 4 sentences would have done it. I know what they are. I have had a long time to write them. None of them came out of me. I stood in a warm room and let a creature 10,000 years old measure a risk in centuries when the risk was going to arrive in days, and I did not correct her arithmetic, because I wanted the 9,000. We did it on the 30th day, at the mouth of the mountain, in the light, with witnesses, because a thing said in the dark is a thing that gets argued about later. Doring came up the switchbacks with her hammer and a portable block and complained about the road the entire way. Umber came down off the scree and stood on the road below the gap like a piece of the road. Hask stood in the gap with his boy Enno, who had never once been down to the town. Kel came because he had asked to and because he could walk on 2 legs now for about an hour at a time, and he wanted to be seen doing it. The Syrian came out into the daylight, which they do not do often, and gave the words herself, in the shape of a woman of 50, in a plain dark dress, on the road above her own town. The gold of Grieve stands behind the mark of Merrick of the Vein, who owns nothing. If the mark cannot pay, Grieve pays. I say it freely. Then Doran put a blank on the block and struck it once, and it came up with the 9 strokes on one side, and on the other side she cut, in 4 letters, the short word for the mountain. 1 coin. Not 9,000. We called it the standing claim before the metal was cold, and it was worth all the rest of them together, because everything else the house would ever issue was a promise about metal, and this one was a promise about her. I put it in my coat. I have carried it since. It has been in a bread bag, in a boot, in a bag of oats, in Doran's slack tub for one particularly bad week, and it has never once been in a box. Kel walked me down. He had the gait of a man who has recently learned that a body is mostly a negotiation, and he kept apologizing to his own knees. It was Umber, at the low gate, who put the thing out loud. She had been quiet the whole way down, which for Umber means she is composing. Then she stopped in the road and put her head round in front of me the way she does. Do you understand what you are carrying? A guarantee. No. That is the polite word for it. Then she gave me the impolite one, and she was not being unkind, she was being accurate, and I have thought about it most nights since. She stands behind you now. Which means she stands under you. Every morning that Mountain gets up and finds out whether a human in a wool coat is still solvent, and she cannot leave, because leaving is the same as failing, and failing is the thing she has promised to pay for. You have not borrowed her gold, Merrick. You have borrowed her. I pointed out that Thessarian was the most powerful creature on this continent and that I was a bankrupt with a stamped disc in his pocket. Yes. Both of those. And what happens to her on the first morning you cannot pay? We opened to the town 11 days later, and Tallow found out what it was worth, and Tallow did not take it well at first, which is the funniest thing that happened to me that whole year. Because here is the thing about the naming. For as long as anyone could remember, we gave it. It was the one thing we handed up the mountain, and it cost nothing, and therefore it was worth nothing, and the arrangement was so old that no one had ever put a price on it any more than you would price breathing. And then I stood at the top of Kettle Row on a market morning on the 9th day market, and offered 2 pennies a month, paid in claims, to any household that would give the naming for Grieve daily instead of once a year. The first person to answer me was the widow Aubrin, from her window, at volume. Do you think I am a fool? And then, before I could get to the second sentence of my life's work, the rest of it. Why was my mouth not worth 2 pennies for the 60 years I have been using it in that doorway? What else in this street has been worth money the whole time with no one mentioning it? That is the day Tallow changed, and it was not a happy day. 2 pennies is nothing. 2 pennies for a thing you are already doing for free is an insult that arrives with money attached, and half the street took it as such. Tib the cooper, who bought my father's coat, informed me to my face that he would not be paid for saying his own prayers. He was not wrong to feel it. He was simply wrong about what it was. 2 pennies is also not a claim. A claim was a whole coin of Grieve, and no household in Kettle Row could break one, so on the second day Doran cut a smaller die and we struck quarter claims, which fit in a fist and moved 4 times as fast, and which I would come to regret in a way I could not possibly have guessed. By the 4th day, 12 households had taken the 2 pennies. By the 9th, the number was 60, because 2 pennies a month in claims turns into a real thing on a real table, and because Tib's neighbor had a new roof. And on the 11th day, the price went up on its own, and I had nothing to do with it. Kettle Row came to me together, which they had organized themselves, and it was when Prattle who put it to me. The going rate for a mouth was now 4 pennies, and if the house did not care to pay it, there were other mountains. There were not other mountains. There was one other mountain in reach, and its owner was Vask, 2 valleys east in a fur coat, sulking about 600 coins, and there was Yirin south of him, who had not yet heard of me at all. They did not know any of that, and they had worked out the shape of it without knowing it, which is what should have frightened me. Because I had spent a month teaching an entire town that the sentence they had said every autumn since their grandmothers was a good. And a good has a price, and a price moves, and it does not move down. Doran found this hilarious for about 2 weeks. She struck the 4-penny claims and she laughed at me over the block and decided that I had invented the most expensive free thing in history. Then she stopped laughing, in the middle of a working morning, with the hammer up, and she said the sentence that would take her 3 more years to finish saying, in which she began right there in the yard. If our mouths are worth this much, what exactly are we buying with them? 2 pennies, and now 4. What else would you like me to buy? I know what we are selling. What are we buying? That mountain has never once come down here except to be told how splendid it is. Now we have found out we can charge her for it. How long before somebody in this street works out we could simply stop? I did not have an answer that morning. I have one now, and it is a bad one, and it is that the day a man like me hears that question in a yard he owns a fifth of, he should put down what he is doing and deal with it. What I actually did was point out that our custom was growing, that the count on Grieve was up by a third since spring, and that we had 11 towns along the Saltway to open next. She looked at me for a moment over the block. Then she went back to striking, and she did not raise it again for a long while, and I took that for agreement, which is the single stupidest thing I have ever taken for anything. The 4 pennies held for 11 weeks. Then Kettle Row worked out the thing that every supplier in history works out eventually, which is that there is one buyer and a great many sellers, and that the sellers can talk to each other. They did it at the Tallystone, which is the flat rock at the top of the market where prices have been called out in this town since before anybody's grandmother, and which had never in its life been used for anything but fish. Andre Vell called them. He is the headman of Tallow, which is a job with no power in it at all, and he had spent 40 years being the man who tells the mountain that everything is fine, and he had watched a bankrupt turn the one thing he administered into a commodity. 61 households stood at that stone on a 9th day and agreed, out where everybody could hear, that not one of them would give the naming for less than 8 pennies, and that any house which broke it would be dealt with by the rest. Necessor, who weaves and who has the loudest voice in the 6 valleys, put it to me across the market. 8, Merrick. Or we shut our mouths and you can go and buy words off the goats. Well, is it 8? I did the arithmetic standing there and it was very bad. 8 pennies on 61 households against what Grieve's count was actually worth to me came out at a loss on every single mouth, and I could not pay it, and I could not be seen to refuse it either. So I let them shut their mouths. 9 days, that is what it cost me, and I have never regretted spending it. For 9 days not one household in Kettle Row gave the naming, and the count on Grieve went flat, and Thessarian sent Eno down twice, and I sent him back up with nothing. On the 4th day the ring held. On the 6th it still held, and Andre Vell was walking the row every evening making sure of it, and Necessor had started saying 9. What broke it was the Embry Yard. There are about 40 households down there that nobody in Kettle Row thinks about, because the Embry Yard burned in my father's time and the people who went back to it are the people who had nowhere else. Bram Aubryn lives there, who is the widow's nephew and who she does not speak to. Fitch the carter lives there with 3 daughters. None of them were at the Tallystone. Nobody had asked them, because in Tallow the Embry Yard is not asked. I went down on the 7th evening with Kell carrying the box and I offered them 5 pennies, which is 1 more than the old price and 3 less than the ring wanted, and I offered it for 4 years, fixed, in writing on the coin itself. Fitch took it in about the time it takes to say yes. So did 31 others, that night, in the dark, with their neighbors 2 streets away holding out for 9. By the 9th morning the count was moving again, and Kettle Row could hear it moving, and Necessor came to the yard before noon. She did not apologize and I did not ask her to. Is the 5-penny term still open? Is it open to me? How long does it stay open? That is the whole of it. A cartel is 61 people who all have to hold, and the Embry Yard is 40 people that nobody counted, and the second thing beats the first thing every time. I gave the term to everybody who came for it inside a fortnight. 5 pennies, 4 years, and I want to set out plainly what I had just done to myself, because at the time I thought I had won something. I had turned the naming from a thing I bought each month into a thing I owed for 4 years. 61 households, then 110, then 200, all of them holding a promise of 5 pennies a month out of a house whose whole income was the count on one mountain. Andre Vell understood it before I did. He came to me at the end of that month, not angry. What happens in the 4th year, if the mountain has stopped paying and the town has not stopped being owed? That, I felt, was a long way off. He is the only man in Tallow who has never once been wrong about anything, and he did not argue, and he went away, and he brought it up again on precisely the morning it happened. The other thing that fortnight did was make me a great many people's employer, and I was not ready for it and I do not think I ever became ready. The theft came in the spring, and it came from a boy, and it broke something I had not known was breakable. Merritt had been paid in quarter claims for 2 years, because she made every coat on that heap and the house paid in what the house had. She kept them in a tin under the cutting table. 311 quarters. On a 9th day, while the whole street was at the market, somebody went in through her yard door and took the tin and left everything else, including 4 crowns in ordinary silver sitting on the shelf above it. That last detail is the one that mattered, and I saw it inside a minute. The thief had left the silver. Whoever it was had known which of the 2 was worth more. It was Rel, who is Fitch's middle daughter's boy, 14, no work, and clever in the way that ruins people. He had it spent inside 9 days, most of it at the split ladle, some of it in Ashland. And here is what stopped me sleeping. Every single one of those 311 quarters worked perfectly. They bought beer. They bought a mule. 2 of them ended up in the hands of a carter at Cobb's Reach who had never heard of merit and who took them at face without a thought, because that is what a quarter claim is for. A stolen coin is still a coin. I had built a thing whose entire virtue was that nobody has to know where it came from, and the price of that virtue was that nobody can know where it came from. André Val wanted them called in. Merit wanted them called in. She stood in the yard with her hands in her apron and asked me to say the numbers off them and make them worthless so that the boy got nothing. There are no numbers on them. There never have been. A quarter claim is 9 strokes on a thumbnail of gold and everyone is exactly the same as every other one, and that is not a flaw in the design, it is the design. So could I call in the series? Void every quarter struck in the 11th week? I thought about it for 2 days and it is the closest I have ever come to killing the house on purpose. Void 1 series and every holder in 3 Valleys starts asking which series is in their pocket, and by the end of the month the quarters are trading at a discount by week of striking, and small money that has to be examined is not small money at all. I paid Merit myself 311 quarters out of the house, and I put it about that the house had done it, and that stolen claims are good claims and always will be. Which is to say I announced, publicly, that robbing anybody in Tala was now worth doing. André Vel came the following week with a proposal that I had no way to refuse and that cost me more over 4 years than the theft did. If the house was going to make money that walks, the town needed men to walk after it. 6 ward men, paid by the house, chosen by the town, and answerable to Vel. I agreed to it in an afternoon and I did not once think about what it meant, and Umber worked it out on the scree 3 weeks later while she was ringing a deposit. You are paying for the men with the sticks. In 400 years I have never once heard of a bank that owns the ward. Somebody is going to ask, one day, who they are actually for. Rel got 2 years breaking stone at the Larn workings. He came back at 16 and Fitch would not have him, and he turned up at my gate in the autumn asking for work, and I gave him work, and he was the best courier the house ever had and he is the reason we knew about the run 4 hours before Rut's cart reached the top of the ridgeway. There is no moral in it. It is simply what happened. There is a threshold. Below it you are what you were born, and above it you can put on our shape, and the threshold does not care how you got there. Kel needed about 40 claims worth of right standing in his name for long enough to hold. He had one. So I did the second thing a house does, after taking money in, which is to lend money out. 40 claims against his own future naming, repaid at 2 a month out of what the house paid him for it. I went through the terms 4 times because he is Kel, and he made me go through them a 5th. And if I cannot pay you, then the claims come back to the house, and you go back down under the threshold. He worked it through in the open, the way he works everything through, standing on a rock in the sun with his eyes half shut. So you can take my face off me. There are moments where a man hears the thing he has built described by somebody who has no interest in being polite about it. I have had 4 of those in my life and Kel has caused 3. Yes, I said. He thought about it for a while, and then he agreed to it, and the reason he gave was the most Kel thing I have ever heard. He said he would rather have a face he could lose than not have one. It took 9 days for the right to settle. On the 10th morning the whole heap came out to watch, which he hated, and it happened at about the pace of a sunrise, and it was the least dramatic miracle in the history of the world. He got smaller. Nobody ever expects that. A creature the size of a hay cart folds down into a young man of perhaps 19 with black hair and enormous hands, and the first sound he made in that shape was a yelp, because he had never in his life had skin. Everything hurt him. Air hurt him. The rock, which he had lain on for 14 years, was suddenly hot enough to take the skin off his feet, and he sat down very fast and then discovered that sitting on hot rock is worse. Tak laughed so hard he fell off a ledge. And then Tak, who had been waiting 60 years, walked round Kel twice, at a distance of about a foot, conducting the survey he had been promising the heap since before I was born. He announced his findings to everybody. He was thorough. He used the whole vocabulary, and where the vocabulary failed him he used his tail, and Umber, who had 4 goats on the other side of that bet, demanded to know why the evidence was not standing up properly and whether that counted as a defect. Kel put both hands over himself. Could somebody find me some cloth? He asked it with tremendous dignity, which under the circumstances was an achievement. That took an argument that I will not reproduce, in which 40 ancient creatures debated whether cloth was for warmth, for modesty, or for keeping the rain off, and in which Umber maintained that humans invented it purely so they could stop looking at each other and start doing business. She is not entirely wrong. I have thought about that a great deal in shops. Merritt the seamstress made his first coat out of 2 of Tibbs' old sacks and charged the house £1 for it, which was robbery, and I paid it without a word because I had watched him try to walk in the meantime. Walking took him 2 days. He kept apologizing to his own knees. He would get 4 steps and then something in the middle of him would decide it was still 4 times heavier than it was, and down he went, and he would lie there and laugh, which is a thing he had never been able to do properly before, because the old body could not make that noise. On the 3rd day he walked through the low gate into Tallow on his own legs, in a sack coat, and half the street came out and the other half shut their doors. The widow Aubryn brought him bread. I want that in the record, because she has never once been kind to me and she went straight past me with it. And then, by the end of that week, the queue started. There are about 900 more on that heap. 900, and I had claims enough in circulation to lift perhaps 30 of them over the threshold without emptying the house. That is the arithmetic. 30 out of 900, and every one of the 900 had watched Kell walk down that road in a coat made of sacking. I want to be honest about how I chose, because the story usually gets told with me choosing the ones who needed it. I chose Dag, because his voice carries across the whole valley and he could do the naming for 6 at once. I chose 4 young ones with good memories who could carry messages down the ridgeway faster than any human. I chose a big gray called Halt who could stand at a door and make people polite. I chose the useful. I chose them on purpose, in order, from a list I made in my head walking up that road, and every one of the 30 was picked because of what the house would get back. Sarn was not chosen. Sarn is older than Umber, says perhaps 9 words a year, and has been on that heap so long the rock has a hollow in it the shape of him. Sarn would have been a poor investment, and I made a note to come back to him in the spring, and I did not. Umber met me at the bottom of the slope on the day the 30 were settled. You picked the strong. Yes. She let that sit. Then she wanted the rest of it, and I gave it to her standing up, because it is the argument I actually believe and I have never found the hole in it. If I lift the weakest first, the house makes nothing back, and in 18 months there is no house, and then nobody gets lifted ever again. 30 now and 300 in 3 years beats 900 now and none of it working. That is a very good reason, Umber said. It is a very good reason. I want you to notice how comfortable you were saying it. Kell was standing behind her with the bread the widow had given him, and he did not say anything at all, which from Kell is the loudest thing available. He remembered it, though. He remembers everything, word for word, and he brought that sentence back out 3 years later at the worst possible moment, in front of people, exactly as I had said it, and it was the single most damaging thing anyone ever did to me. I went down to Carrow that summer to try to break out of the 6 valleys, and I came back understanding that I had been running a village enterprise and calling it a trade. Carrow is a city. It sits where the salt road meets the water, and the men who matter there meet at the weighing, which is a hall with a floor of black stone and a set of scales in the middle that have not been moved since anybody can remember. They do not use money at the weighing. They use salt weight, which is a promise of so many measures of salt out of a store in the docks, and it is 400 years old, and it works across 9 ports, and I had never heard of it. That was the first thing that took the wind out of me. I had spent 5 years thinking I had invented paper. There was a room full of grey men trading promises against a warehouse before my grandfather was born, and none of them had ever heard of me either, and they did not care. Their master of the scales is a woman called Hesper Bly, who is about 70 and who listened to me for an hour and a half without a single interruption, which I have since learned is the most expensive silence in that city. Then she asked me 4 questions. So what is behind the coin? Gold on deposit. Whose gold? Dragons. And I watched the room hear it. And when a dragon wants it back, he does not. That is the whole design. A dragon holding a claim has what he wants. And when a man in Carrow wants it back, then he comes to Tallow, which is 9 days by the Ridgeway, and the house pays him. Hesper Bly put both hands on the rail in front of her. How far is Tallow from this room, in days? Then she gave me the verdict, and she was kind about it, and it was the most useful hour of my life. 9 days. Saltway pays at any of 4 doors in this city inside an afternoon, at the weighing, at Dell's, at the long store or at Kesh Iron's counter on the quay. Nobody here is going to hold a promise that lives 9 days away, in a town with 1 road into it, backed by creatures who could eat the man who signed it. Then she gave me the sentence I have repeated to every person who has ever worked for me. Your coin is not bad. Your coin is far away. In this trade, those are the same word. I stayed 11 days and I got 3 houses to take the 9 strokes at a discount, which is not a market, it is a courtesy. And I met the brass men, and I drank with a founder named Ansel Roque who told me about a quiet buyer from Ashland who had been in Cairo twice that spring. Who in this city can cut a die? That was all he had wanted to know. I did not think anything of it. There is a great deal I did not think anything of that year. What I brought home was the shape of the problem, and it is the shape of the whole rest of this story, so I will put it plainly. A promise is worth what it costs you to turn it back into a thing. Every mile between the holder and the door is a discount, and every day is a discount, and the only cure is more doors. I could not build doors. I had 1 box, 1 block, and a mountain road, which is exactly why, 8 months later, when a courteous man from Cairo stood in a small clean room and offered me a second door in Ashland with no ceiling on it, I agreed before he had finished the sentence, and thought I had one. The second house opened in Ashland at the end of that winter, and the man who opened it came up the ridgeway in a good coat to introduce himself, which I thought at the time was the best news I had ever had. His name was Osric. He was from Cairo, down where the salt money is, and he had the manner of a man who has spent his life being trusted with other people's small disasters. I liked him at once, and I want that on the record too, because it has been suggested since that I should have known. I should have known. I did not, and the reason I did not is that he was easy to be with, and I had been carrying the whole thing alone for a year. He did not want anything from me on that first visit. That was the clever part. He came, he looked at Doran's block, he asked 3 questions about the quarter claims, and he told me the honest truth about his own house, which was that it was small and slow and short of good metal. Then he made the proposal that made the trade a trade. He wanted mutual honor. A claim struck in tallow to be paid in Ashland, and a claim struck in Ashland to be paid in tallow, both houses good for both. Nobody carrying gold down a road with bandits on it. A man in Marrow Ford holding a disc that works in 2 places instead of 1. I have never in my life said yes to anything faster. Understand what that does. Alone, I was a curiosity. 2 houses honoring each other is a system, and a system is what I had told Thessarian I wanted on the day she offered me 1,000 coins and I turned them down. Doran hated him inside a minute. She could not say why, which infuriated her more than the man did. She stood at her block with the hammer down and watched him go out of the yard, and her verdict was that his coat was new and his hands were old. Is that not true of every man who has come up in the world? Then came the other thing, which I dismissed and which I have thought about most nights since. She said he had stood in her yard for 2 hours next to a fire and never once moved away from the heat, and never once moved into it. Over that spring Osric began buying claims. Not from me. From holders. He would take a tallow claim off a carter in Ashland and pay a halfpenny over face for it, and the carter would go away delighted, and Osric would put the disc in his box. I watched him do it for 4 months and I concluded that he was a slightly foolish man with more money than sense, because a claim bought above face is a claim bought at a loss, and there is no way to make that back. There is one way to make it back. It requires you to hold about 1/5 of everything a house has ever issued and then walk in one morning and ask for the metal. I did not think of it, because I was busy, and because thinking of it would have meant thinking about a man I had started to like. Yirin came in the autumn, and she came alone, and she came in our shape, which none of the big ones did in those days except Thessarian. She was young, 400, which for them is a woman of about 25, and her mountain is Bran, south of Kern, and she had heard about the house from a carter at Cobb's Reach and had ridden 3 days to find out whether it was true. She did not want to be told how it worked. She wanted 2 numbers, and when I gave her them she did the arithmetic in front of me faster than I did, and then came the question that nobody, including Thessarian, had put to me yet. If the claims can be spent, can they be spent on more claims? Yes. She was gone by dusk and back in 11 days with 4,000 coins, which was the whole of Bran and most of her mother's, and she put every one of them into the house and took the claims and put those to work buying naming from 3 towns at once. Inside one season Yirin's count was rising faster than Greaves had ever risen. By spring it passed Vask, who wrote me a letter, which was a novelty, and which contained 7 separate threats and 1 request for a loan. By midsummer it passed Thessarian. I found out because Thessarian sent Eno, Hask's boy, down the mountain with 4 words, which is the shortest message I have ever received and the most expensive. She came the following day, and she came into the town. I do not think Tallow had ever had one of them walk in through the low gate in daylight and stand in the market. The 9th day was on. There were turnips. She was very good about it for the first hour. She looked at things. What is cloth for? Merritt gave her a straight answer, and paid for a shawl with a coin that was worth more than the shop, and would not take change because she did not understand what change was. Then a dung cart came down Kettle Row and the carter wanted her out of the way, and did not know who she was, and made that plain, and she stood aside. I watched a creature 10,000 years old step into a doorway to let 200 weight of manure go past, and I want to be clear that the expression on her face was not anger. It was arithmetic. She was pricing something. She had a room at the Split Ladle that night because it got dark, and the potman charged her 4 pennies for it, and she found that genuinely offensive in a way that nothing else in the town managed. 4 pennies. For a bed. That I am in for one night and then leave. That is what a bed costs. Then why does anyone leave? It is either the stupidest or the cleverest question I was handed that whole year, and I have never decided which. In the morning she put it to me plainly, and there was no arithmetic in her voice at all. Stop urine. On what grounds? And what does stopping her look like? Take no more of her metal. Refuse her claims at your block. She is 400 years old and she is above me because a man in a wool coat decided to be even-handed. And I refused. I did it too fast. That is my honest reading of that morning. I had the right answer and I handed it over flat, like a man reading out a price, and not once did I offer the thing that might have helped, which is that I understood exactly what it cost her to have to come down a mountain and stand in a market and ask. The house takes anybody's metal. The day it stops, every holder in 3 Valleys starts wondering whose side the mark is on, and a mark that has a side is worth nothing. She heard me out. She did not raise her voice. She has never once raised her voice at me. Then she set out what she was going to do, and she did it the same afternoon, and it was entirely within her rights. From that day, no household in Tallow, in the Embry Yard, or anywhere in the 6 Valleys under Grieve was permitted to give the naming for any mountain except hers. Not for payment, not for friendship, not at all. She did not ban the house. She was far too good for that. She banned my customers from selling me the only thing I had to sell, in the only place where I had any of them. 60 households on 4 pennies each. 200 more I had been about to sign. Every mouth in Urin's account, every mouth in Vask's, gone in an afternoon, and Urin's 4,000 coins sitting in my box with nothing to do. Doran worked it out before I did, because she was at the block when the first family came back to hand in their quarter claims. Well. Now we find out whether you built a house or a favor. The Saltway does not have a mountain over it. That is the whole reason those towns exist, and it took me 4 days on the road to understand that it made them useless to me. In Tallow, the naming is older than the street plan. In Marrow Ford they had never given a naming in their lives, had no word for it, and when I explained the arrangement to the first innkeeper he wanted to establish which of us was mad. You want to pay me to say a sentence about a mountain I have never seen? Yes. Every day? Yes. And who is stopping you saying it yourself? That is the question, and the answer is that I am a man and my mouth is worth nothing, and no innkeeper in Marrow Ford is going to take that on faith from a stranger with a bag of stamped discs. So the first 11 days on that road were the worst selling of my life, and I have sold barrel futures to a man whose barrels had burned. What turned it was Kell, and Kell turned it by being incapable of doing what I do. I put him in front of the Cobb's Reach carters because he could carry the box and because a young man who was a dragon last spring is a thing people will come and look at. My instruction was to keep it short. A carter put it to him straight. Are the discs safe? Straight answer, none of the traitor talk. And Kell gave them all of it. That the house had one box, that the box had a bottom, that if everybody came at once there would not be enough, that the house had already once handed out metal that did not work and had bought it back at a loss, and that his own face would come off him if he failed to pay 2 claims a month. I stood behind him doing the arithmetic on how long it would take me to walk out of that yard. 41 households signed that afternoon. I have gone over it many times. The nearest I can get is that every one of those carters had spent their whole lives being sold things by men like me, and not one of them had ever heard the bottom of the box described out loud by somebody who was standing on it. Kell did not do it to be clever. He is not capable of the other thing. That was the year I started sending him ahead of me, and the year I started being careful what I let out in front of him. Ashland was already taken. 31 households, all of them on Osric's paper, all of them content. He had been there since before the winter, and he had done it quietly, and he had done it without once coming up the Ridgeway to mention it. We had the conversation in his front room, which was small and clean and had one chair too few, so he stood. He put it to me without any pressure at all. 6 valleys under grieve to me. The salt way in Caro to him. Mutual honor continues, both marks good in both houses, no house crossing into the other's ground. And when tallow is full and I need more mouths, then you come to me, and we discuss it, as neighbors. Is that so terrible? There it is. That is the entire trap, laid out in daylight by a man being scrupulously honest with me. He was not lying. Everything he described came true exactly as he described it. I could have fought him for the salt way. I want to set out what that would have taken, because I have been called weak for it since, and the people who call it that have never had to price a war. Undercutting him in 11 towns for a year, paying above the going rate for mouths in his own ground. Carrying that out of a box that had 9,000 of Thessarians coins in it and 4,000 of urins and about 600 that were genuinely mine to move. And the first time a holder in Ashland asked for metal in the middle of that, the house would have been found out, because a house that is fighting is a house that is spending, and I could not spend. So I took the piece. I shook a man's hand in a small clean room and gave away 2/3 of the human mouths in the world in exchange for 18 months of quiet. He wanted one more thing on the way out, in the doorway, in the tone people use for afterthoughts. No limit on the mutual honor. Ashland claims payable in tallow without a ceiling, tallow claims payable in Ashland the same. Clean and simple, no arguments about caps. I agreed to it in the doorway with my coat half on. I have described that morning to Doran, to Umber, and once, years later, to Thessarian. Doran used a short word. Umber had nothing at all for a while. What does the word ceiling mean, and why did you let it go for free? Thessarian gave me the only thing that ever made me feel better about it, which was that she had made the same class of error twice, and that both times it had taken about 200 years to arrive. Mine took 19 months. The other mountains had been watching Grieve get rich, and after the ban on tallow they had all learned the same lesson from it, which was that a mountain can shut its own valleys whenever it likes. Vask did it first, out of spite, in the autumn. No household in the 3 valleys under Kern was to give the naming for anybody but him. Then Thole did it on the coast, because Thole does whatever the last dragon he spoke to did. Then Bevan, who was not spiteful and who simply did not want to be the only one who had not. Inside a season, 4/5 of the human mouths I could reach were sealed inside somebody's valley, each one permitted to name exactly one mountain, which was the mountain over them. That is the moment the house nearly died the first time, and almost nobody remembers it, because the thing that saved it looks obvious now and took me most of a winter. If a mouth in Hollis may only name Kern, then Kern is the only thing it can be paid for naming. Fine, let it name Kern, and let Kern pay for it, and let the claim it is paid with be spendable in Westerfold and Dray and Tallow and anywhere else the 9 strokes are known. The naming is local. The claim does not have to be. I put it to Vask at Kern in front of a roast bird, and I put it badly, and he agreed to it for the worst possible reason, which is that he thought he was taking something off me. He was under the impression that he had just bought his own valley's mouths at a discount. What he had actually done was make his 3 valleys into customers of a house he did not control, whose paper his own tenants now preferred to his own gold. Bevan took it in a week. Thole took it in a month, after a conversation on a beach that I would rather not describe, in weather he brought with him. By the following spring there were 9 towns on the 2 mountain claim, and a carter could go from Hollis to Dray to Marrow Ford with 9 strokes in his pocket and never once carry metal, and the road between them stopped being worth robbing. The first default did not come from a dragon. It came from a miller in Ludd's Cross, and it took 9 days to reach me and 11 weeks to stop. What Dunn had borrowed against 4 years of naming to put a second wheel in, and the second wheel had gone in, and then the Saltmere Road had washed out in the spring and the grain that was to have come through Ludd's Cross went round by turn instead. He could not pay. That is all. No fraud, no complaint, a man and a wheel and a road that moved. And Neve Tari, who holds our block at Ludd's Cross and who is the sharpest person in this trade under 50, did the correct thing, which was to call his claims home, which meant that the 12 households in Ludd's Cross holding what Dunn's coin for flour were holding paper the house had just refused, and by the following market they had told Turn, and Turn had told Barrow Hollow. Nobody in any of those towns was frightened of what Dunn. What they were frightened of was that a 9-stroke coin had been good on Tuesday and not good on Thursday, and that nobody had been able to tell by looking. OSK Bellin at Westerfold shut his door for 3 days on his own authority rather than pay out on paper he could not price, which was sensible and which nearly finished us in that valley. I went round the 9 towns myself that summer with Rel and 2 of his couriers, and it took 11 weeks, and it is the hardest ordinary work I have ever done. Every town had the same thing on, wearing a different face. Pruselo at Saltnir would not take a Dray coin. Hemi Cor at Turn would take a Dray coin and not a Hollis one. Bevan's tenants at Barrow Hollow had begun quietly refusing anything that had come off a cart from Kern, because Kern is Vask and everybody knew about the quarters. The mark had stopped being one thing. It was 9 things with the same strokes on them, priced separately in a market I could not see. The cure took me a month to find, and it was not clever. It was expensive, which is worse. I made the house liable for every block. Not Neve Tari's mistakes, not OSK Bellin's caution. I said it out loud at Westerfold, in OSK Bellin's front room, with the door open and half his street in the lane behind me, because a rule nobody hears is not a rule. Neve Tari had ridden over from Ludd's Cross to hear it said. She did not wait for me to finish. If the house eats every bad loan, what am I for? You are for lending well. Then pay me for lending well, and stop paying me the same as a man who shuts his door for 3 days because he is frightened. OSK Bellin went red and studied his own floor and did not disagree with her, which was the worst thing he could have done for either of them. I told her she was right. I told her in front of him and in front of the doorway, and then I did it anyway. She put one more thing to me and I have never answered it properly. Whose caution is it that you are being generous with? Then she wrote the new terms out in her own hand, because that is who she is, and she did not speak to me until autumn. Any 9-stroke coin, anywhere, honored at any door, and if a block took a bad loan the house ate it and dealt with the block afterward in private. Which means I took the discipline out of 9 people who had every reason to be careful and put it in one box in tallow. Umber told me at the time. She said I had just paid 9 towns to stop thinking. She was right, and I did it anyway, because a coin which has to be examined is not a coin, and I would rather be robbed by my own agents than be one of 9 things. What done kept the wheel. He paid it back over 6 years, slowly, and the last payment came in the 2nd year of the second house, and he sent it up with a note that Rel read out to me because I did not want to open it in front of anybody. Neve Tari never forgave me for that room, and she was right not to. She left us for Urin's house at Dray 8 years later, and she is better at this than I am and always was. That summer cost the house about 900 coins and it bought a thing that had not existed anywhere in the world before, which is a promise that is worth exactly the same in 9 towns on the same morning. Hesper Bly would have told me what that is called. It took me until Caro to hear the word. And the count on every one of those mountains went up, which meant that 4 of the largest creatures alive had each, separately, worked out that they were better off with me than without me. And none of them had noticed that they had also all become the same thing, which is depositors in one box in a town none of them had ever bothered to look at. Thessarian noticed. She had been counting since the winter, badly and by herself, and at the end of that year she did the one thing that changed the shape of everything afterward, and she did it without telling me. She hired a counter. She took Enno, who was Hask's boy, 16, who had walked up and down that mountain with messages for 2 years and who had been in the room every single time I had explained anything to anybody. I found out in the spring when I went up with the quarters numbers and she corrected me. Not on a judgment. On an arithmetic error, in the 3rd figure, which she had found because a 16-year-old had been doing the same sum in a room down the passage for 4 months. The forgeries started in the spring, and they started small, which is why they worked. A quarter claim is the size of a thumbnail. It has 9 strokes on one face and nothing on the other, and it moves through 6 hands a day in a market. Nobody looks at it. That is the entire point of small money. When Prattle brought the first 2 to Doran's yard because he had a bad feeling and no better reason, and he put them on the block, and she rang them one after the other with the back of a file. Same weight. Same color. Different note. The strokes were good. Whoever cut the die had held a real quarter claim for a long time. He had got the depth wrong on the 4th and 7th stroke, which is a thing you can see if you know, and Doran knows, and about 4 people in the world besides her know. The metal underneath was Kern gold, and Kern gold has a gray in it that everything from that mountain has, and it took Doran about 6 seconds to name the owner. That is Vask. He has cut a sister of my sister. Here is what a forgery actually does, and the money is the smallest part of it. 11 forged quarters is pocket change. The damage is that from the moment when Prattle walked out of that yard talking, no one in Tallow could tell whether the thing in their hand was real. By the 2nd afternoon the split ladle was refusing quarter claims. By the 3rd, Tib was refusing them, and Tib had 60 of them under his floor. By the 4th morning there was a line outside Doran's gate of people wanting their small money rung. A line outside the house is the sound I hear when I cannot sleep. I had heard it once before in my life and I had lost everything I owned inside 2 hours of hearing it. I had 3 moves. I could call the forgeries in. That means telling every holder that some of the discs in their pocket are worthless, and then making them queue to find out which. That is a run. That is what a run actually looks like from the inside, and it does not matter that only 11 are bad. I could hunt fast 2 valleys east, with what, and taking how long? Or I could do the third thing, which I did at 4 in the morning in Doran's yard with the fire down, and which Doran fought me on harder than she has ever fought me on anything. Every disc bearing the 9 strokes is good at this house. Struck by us or not. Bring it, we pay it. She put the hammer on the block, which she does instead of shouting. You have just made his forgery legal. I know. He can print your obligations in his own hall out of his own dead metal and you will honor them. I know. Then what in the name of anything is the point of the mark? And out of me came the biggest thing I ever put into words, and I did not understand a word of it at the time. The point of the mark was that people would take it, and that anything which made them stop taking it was the only thing that could kill us, and 11 bad coins were not worth dying over. We put it about that morning. Kel walked Kettle Row saying it. Dag gave it from the top of the scree, where the whole valley can hear him. The line at Doran's gate turned into a line at the house, and I paid every single disc anybody brought me for 2 days, good, bad, and one that was quite clearly a button. By the 4th day the quarters were moving again at face. By the 7th, nobody in Tallow was ringing anything. Vask made about 1100 quarters before he stopped, which we know because he boasted about it, at length, in the split ladle, in the shape of an old man, over several evenings, until Merritt hit him with a stool. He had expected to ruin me. What he had actually done was hand me 1100 claims worth of other people's obligations and get nothing for it at all, and he never once worked out why I was not angry. Umber worked it out standing in the yard the following week, and she put it to me in the plain flat voice she uses for things she has just seen. You have made the mark worth more than the metal. That is a nice way of putting it. It is not a way of putting it. Go and count. What do you think you will find? So I went and counted, and that is the night everything I thought I knew came apart in about 2 hours. Here is the count. 9,000 coins from Grieve. 4,000 from Bran. 1,160 from Kern that we had kept, and about 600 of Doran's sweepings that had never been repaid. 14,760 in the box, near enough, and claims in the world, struck by us, that I could account for, 15,200, because we had been lending against future naming for a year and every one of those loans was a disc that existed with no coin under it. Plus Vask's 1,100. I did it 3 times. I did it on paper, and then I did it out loud, and then I did it again with Doran saying the numbers back to me, and it came out the same 3 times. There were 1,540 more claims walking around the world than there was gold to pay them. I sat in that yard for a long time. My hands were doing the thing they do. Because I have been here before, on a morning in a lane with 40 people at my door, and what I am describing is the exact condition that ended the vein. And nothing was happening. Nobody had slipped. Urin's count was rising. Kel was sitting on Doran's wall with his boots off, complaining about blisters, in the shape of a man, held up by a right that had 1,540 more mouths on it than there was metal underneath. I went up to the scree at dawn, and I took 40 of the discs Doran had rung as certainly false, and I went to Sarn. Sarn is older than Umber. He was not chosen in the spring, because he would have been a poor investment, and I had made a note to come back to him and had not. He was in his hollow. The rock has worn to the shape of him over 400 years. I put 40 forged quarters down in front of him, 10 claims worth of nothing at all, cut out of a dead dragon's grey gold by a fat old liar 2 valleys east, and I gave the words. These are Sarn's, and I say so freely, and the house stands behind everyone. It took 2 days. He came up out of that hollow in the shape of a man on the second evening, and the first thing he did was put his hand flat on the rock where he had been lying, as if checking that it was still there. Sarn says perhaps 9 words a year. He used 4 of them that night. I did not expect this. I sat on the scree in the dark with Umber next to me and I put it out loud, because a thing like that has to be spoken or it stays a suspicion. It was never the gold. The gold does not hold anybody up. The gold is where everybody agreed to look. What holds a dragon together is that somebody else says the right is his, and the coin under it is a stone in a field that we all point at so that we can agree what we are talking about. Which means the coin can be short. which means the coin can be absent, which means that as long as they take the mark, I can make right out of the air, in any quantity, for as long as they take it. Umber let me finish, and then came the question that has been the whole rest of my life. And what happens on the day they stop? I did not answer her, because down at the bottom of the valley, in a house in Ashland, a quiet man from Cairo had spent that same spring sorting quarter claims into 2 boxes. I know he was sorting them, because 11 days later a consignment came up the ridgeway from Ashland for honor, and every single one of the discs in it was a Vask forgery, and every good coin had stayed south. He had known before I did. He had been paying half a penny over face for 4 months, and now he was quietly handing me back the counterfeits and keeping the metal, and doing it inside an agreement I had signed in a doorway with my coat half on. From that spring, nobody in 3 Valleys was hunting gold anymore. There was no point. The valuable thing in this world was a man in a wool coat who could say a sentence, and everybody who mattered now knew it. Vask came back in the autumn after the forgeries, in the fur coat, and he came to buy his way back in. He had worked out what everybody works out, which is that being outside the house was costing him more every season than being inside it had ever cost him. Bevan's count was rising. Thol's count was rising. Kern had gone flat the day a forgery of our die came out of his haul and the house stopped striking for him, and it had stayed flat since the spring. He did not apologize. He is not capable of it and I did not need it. He stood in the yard and offered 1,100 good coins, cleanly got, and he offered them at a discount to himself, which is to say he offered to be charged for the privilege. And Umber refused him. That is the arrangement and I had built it myself. Nothing comes into the box that she has not put her face over, and she gets paid whether she approves or refuses, and I had told her to her face that the day I paid her only for approvals was the day the house stopped being worth anything. I stood in that yard and wanted 1,100 coins very badly. She went over every one of them on the block, took her time, and then she told him, in front of Doran and Kell and 2 carters, that the metal was clean and the man was not. Her reasoning was not sentimental. She said that a creature who cuts a die once will cut one again, that the house had no way to tell his good faith from his bad, and that the cost of being wrong about Vask was every quarter claim in the 6 Valleys. Then, with what I thought was real dignity, he put it to her. What would I have to do to be let in? Nothing. There is nothing. That is what it costs. He went south 9 days later and spent 2 evenings in Ashland telling a quiet man everything he knew about my box, my block, my 2 mountain claims, the wardmen I paid for, and the exact week in which the house had first struck more paper than it could cover. I have never been able to be angry about that. Umber was right and it cost us, and both of those are true, and any man who tells you a rule only ever helps you has never had to keep one. I lifted the scree that summer. All of it, 906 of them, in 12 waves, out of a box that did not have the metal and never would. I am not going to pretend I agonized. I did it 11 days after the night with Sarn, and I did it because I could, and because I had spent a year handing out 30 faces at a time to the useful while 900 watched. Doran struck the discs. She did not argue about that one. She was at the block for 6 days straight and she took a fever at the end of it and would not stop. And when the last wave went up the ridgeway she went home and slept for a day and a half. They came over the threshold in the order the rite settled, which meant it happened all over that heap at odd hours, and there was no ceremony at all. There was just a great deal of noise and a great many people falling over. Halt came up so big that Merritt had to sew 2 coats together. A young one called Finn came up and immediately walked into a rock, because eyes at that height see a different world. Tot came up small and quick and spent his entire first evening finding out what a laugh does to a human chest and giving himself hiccups. Sarn stood at the top of the heap in his hollow and looked down at 900 people in sacking and did not use a single word. Umber refused. I want that recorded properly, because it is the thing about her that I understood last. I offered her the claims and she looked at them on the rock for a while and pushed them back with her nose. I have been this for 400 years. I am good at it. I can smell a dead coin at a foot and I can carry a man 2 valleys in a night and I have a hollow that fits me. Why would I want to be 4 feet of soft thing that gets cold? And when I started to explain the advantages she cut me off, and what came out of her has never stopped being true. You are giving away the only thing you have, and you are giving it to 900 creatures who have never in their lives had to be anywhere at a particular time. How many of them can you feed by Tuesday? Answer that, and then tell me how clever it was. Tallow had about 800 people in it. I put 900 more into the valley in 11 days, in high summer, 6 weeks before the harvest, and not one of them had ever eaten anything that had been cooked, worn anything, slept indoors, or understood why you cannot simply take a loaf off a table if you are hungry and the loaf is there. The first fortnight was very funny. I laughed a great deal. So did they, mostly. There was the business of clothes, which took a month to settle and which Merritt made a small fortune out of, and which involved several public arguments about what exactly was being covered and why. Conducted at volume in the market by creatures with 1,000 years of practice at not being embarrassed. There was talk in the split ladle discovering beer, and then discovering the morning, and then coming to me at noon in genuine distress to report that he had been poisoned by the potman and would be dying shortly. There was one who ate a candle. There were 4 who could not be persuaded that a door was not a suggestion. There was a fortnight where nobody in Tallow could keep a chicken, and by the 3rd week it had stopped being funny, and it had stopped being funny in the way these things always do, which is quietly and in the accounts. 900 bodies eat. A dragon on that heap ate a goat a fortnight and could go a month if it had to. A human body of the same person eats every day, 3 times, and gets sick if it does not, and it is a very stupid arrangement and nobody had thought to mention it in advance. The price of bread in Tallow went up by 1/3 in 19 days. Then flour. Then, absurdly, firewood, because 900 people who have never been cold discover cold all at once. I printed. Of course I printed. That is what I had just learned to do, and I did it with a clear head and I would do it again, and it bought food for about 5 weeks. Then the farmers along the 6 valleys worked out what everyone works out, which is that if there is twice as much money in the same amount of bread, the bread simply costs twice as much, and my claims started buying less every week. 3 of them died that autumn. A young one called Gethin drowned in the mill race, in 4 feet of water, because a body that cannot fly panics. One of the older ones took a fever off bad water in the Embry yard. And Halt, who was the biggest thing in the valley and who I had picked in the spring because he could stand in a doorway and make people polite, went through a rotten floor in the dark and broke something in his back and did not get up again. Not one of those 4 things could have touched them the year before. That is the sentence I have never been able to get around. Doran found me in the yard the night after Halt. There was no unkindness in it and none of it was meant to wound, and she had been at that block for 6 days making it possible. You did not make a miracle. You made 900 refugees, and the only trade any of them has is a sentence, and you are the only buyer. The bread went first, and then the flour, and then everything else in an order I could have predicted and did not. By the 2nd week of that autumn a loaf in Tallow cost what a loaf and a half had cost in the spring. By the 4th week it was 2. Necessior, who had held out for 9 pennies at the tally stone the year before, was earning 5 and buying it double, and she was one of the lucky ones, because she was earning it all. Andrevel came to me on the first cold morning with the thing he had been waiting 4 years to say, and he did not enjoy saying it. 200 families on your 5-penny term. Fixed for 4 years, in writing on the coin, and the coin buys half what it bought when they signed. I would raise the term, then. With what? I did not have an answer that was not printing, and he knew it was not an answer, because Andrevel has been buying grain for this town for 40 years and he understands the only thing about money that matters, which is that you cannot eat more of it. I printed anyway. 11,000 quarters in 9 weeks, and it bought food for about 5 weeks of that, and then the farmers along the 6 valleys did the arithmetic that farmers always do. Harrow Pell, who has the best land under Grieve, who keeps the store at the Low Gate, and who had taken claims for 2 years without a murmur, stood in his own yard and told me he would sell for metal or he would not sell. I did not have metal. I had 11 carts of paper and 900 people who had never been hungry in their lives because a dragon does not get hungry the way we do, and who were now finding out about it all at once and in public. They took it better than we did. I did not expect that and I have never forgotten it. There was no theft worth the name on the scree that winter. They queued. Nobody had taught them to queue, and they were extremely bad at it. And they did it anyway, because Sarn stood at the head of the line on the first morning and would not move until everyone behind him had been counted off, and after that it was simply how it was done. Tak gave his ration away 4 times that I know of and lied about it every time, badly. The riot, when it came, was ours. Kettle Row went to Pell's store at the Low Gate on a 9th day in the 4th month, about 90 of them, with Bram Auburn at the front, and what they wanted was not the grain. What they wanted was for it to stop going up the ridgeway to feed 900 creatures who had been nothing but a story 2 years before. Fitch the carter had his arm broken in the door of that store by a man he had known 30 years. 2 of the wardmen I paid for, Jared Boyce and a man I will not name, stood aside and let it happen, and one of them, whose name I will not put down because he has children in this town, told Vel afterward that he had not signed on to hold a door against his own street. Umber worked out what that meant before I did. You are paying for the men with the sticks, she had said, and somebody is going to ask who they are for, and the answer came back that winter and the answer was, not for me. Kel stopped it, not by standing in the door, which he offered to do and which would have ended with somebody dead. He went and got Merritt and the widow Aubrin and put them in front of Bram, and the widow talked to her nephew in the doorway of a grain store for about 4 minutes in a voice nobody else could hear, and the 90 went home. What did you say to him? That she had 211 quarters from my house under her floor and that if the mountain people starved, her quarters were worth exactly nothing, and that he could have half of what she had if he went home now and none of it if he did not. She had understood the whole mechanism from the inside, in a doorway, with no arithmetic at all. I have employed men who never got there in 4 years. Urine came up the ridgeway in the 5th month with 300 head of cattle, and she did it without being asked, and she charged me for them. I want that in the record exactly as it happened, because it has been told since as a kindness and it was a transaction and she would be insulted to hear otherwise. 300 head, at a price we argued about for 2 hours, paid in wage-backed claims against 4 years of naming from the scree, at a rate that was very good for her and that I took because it was the only offer on the table. She stood in the yard afterward and told me the truth about why she had done it, which was that 600 of her mouths lived on that heap and a dead mouth names nobody. Then she asked the question that turned out to be the beginning of everything Thessarian did to me the following spring. Where else can they get fed? Nowhere. There is no other source of that much meat in the 6 valleys. There is one. She has grass in her lower valleys that has never had anything on it but weather, and she has been keeping it empty for 10,000 years because there was nothing she wanted to put on it. I did not believe her. That is the honest shape of it. I had spent 4 years thinking of Thessarian as the largest depositor in my box, and it had not once occurred to me that a mountain is also 200 square miles of land with nobody on it. Eno had already made the same calculation for her, on paper, in a room down the passage, and she had been standing in her own lower valleys looking at grass since before the first frost. Thessarian came to the scree at the end of that winter, and she came with carts. I have thought about that for years and I still cannot decide when she started planning it. My best guess is the night she stood aside for the dung cart in Kettle Row, because that is when she started pricing things she had never had to price. She did not come to gloat. She came at midday with 11 carts of salt beef and 4 of grain and a herd of 200 behind her on the road, and she stood in the middle of a heap full of hungry people in a plain dark dress and made them an offer. The lower valleys of Grieve, grazing, water, the 2 mill villages, the timber on the north side. Herds to start with and seed for the spring. Roofs before the snow. For one thing. The naming, daily, for Grieve alone. Not for Bran. Not for Kern. Not through the house. Her exact words were the cleanest piece of business I have ever heard done, and she did not once mention me. He can print you a promise. I have brought you a cow. I was standing 40 feet away with Kel and I did not open my mouth, because there was nothing in my box, in my mark, or in my head that beat a cow in the first week of winter. Dag went. He was the first, and he came to me before he did it and put it to my face, which I have always been grateful for. He has a voice that carries across a valley and he had 6 people depending on it. Sarn went. That is the one. Sarn, who had 400 years in a hollow and who I lifted with 40 forged quarters on a whim, walked down the ridgeway with Thessarian's people, and he did not look at me, and I do not blame him, and it took the legs out from under me in a way that Halt's floor had not managed. 640 went in 9 days. 9 days is a long time to watch 640 people decide. I did not stop them and I did not beg, and I have wondered since whether that was dignity or whether it was simply that I could not think of a sentence that beat a cow. I did try 3 things, and they all failed, and they failed in ways that taught me something, which is the only reason I put them down. The first was arithmetic, which is what I always reach for. I stood on the heap and showed them the 4-year figure. Grass and cattle now, against claims that in 4 years would buy a mill share and a roof and a place in a town. How many of us are alive in 4 years? That was fun, and there was no bitterness in it, because he had watched Halt go through a floor and he wanted the number. I did not have it. Nobody had ever calculated the death rate of a dragon in a human body, because until 18 months earlier there had not been any. The second was Kel. I asked him to speak for the house, and he refused, and it is the only time he has ever refused me anything. He would not do it because he could not say it was the better offer, and he will not say a thing he has not checked. He offered instead to stand up and say what he actually thought, which was that he did not know, and I told him that was worse than nothing, and he agreed, and that was the end of that conversation and the beginning of a coolness that lasted a year. The third was Vel. I sent Andre Vel up the ridgeway to talk to them about what a town is, because he has been running one for 40 years and I thought it might land. They listened to him for an hour, and they liked him, and Fitch's daughters came up with him and there was a good deal of laughing, and then Umber asked him one question that ended it. Would Tallow have taken 900 of them in the 4th month of that winter, if the mountain had not been feeding half of them? Vel is an honest man. He said no. It would have gone the way the grain store went and worse, and he put it in front of about 400 of them. Dag came to me the evening before he left. He had 6 on his account, including 2 who could not have carried their own claims down the road, and he had a voice you can hear across a valley and had never once used it against me. Will you call this a betrayal? No, and I meant it, and then out came something I regret, which was that I hoped he would remember who had lifted him. He did not answer that, and he is not cruel. He came back 11 months later on the day of the run, on his own legs, without being sent for, and he stood in that lane all night, and he never once mentioned what I had said to him on the heap. Sarn did not come to me at all. He went down the ridgeway with the 3rd group in the morning, in the coat Merritt had made him, and he did not look up, and I stood at the gate of the yard and watched 400 years of a hollow in a rock walk past me for a cow. I have run that morning back more times than any other in this story, and the thing I keep arriving at is that I had never once gone up there and simply asked him what he wanted. I picked him because he was cheap to lift, and I lifted him because it proved something I needed proved, and it did not occur to me at any point in 18 months to find out who he was. Umber stayed. Why? Because nobody had offered her anything at all, and she preferred it that way. Tak stayed. He gave 3 reasons over the course of that month, all of them different, all of them jokes, and the true one came out about a year later at the split ladle, which was that in Thessarian's valleys there was no potman to argue with. 260 stayed, and I would like to write that they stayed out of loyalty. Perhaps 40 did. The rest stayed because they owed the house and believed that leaving with a debt would take their faces off them, and I knew that was what they believed, and I did not go up there to correct it. That is the cost I actually paid that winter, and it did not show up in any column. The 260 built a town that winter and did not ask anybody's permission, and I did not find out what it meant for 8 months. They called it the 9, after the strokes, which I found flattering until Umber explained that they had named it after the coin and not after me and that the difference was the whole point. It is on the flat below the tooth, where the scree runs out into good water. Holt had picked the ground before he died and they built where he said. By the 2nd spring there were 3 streets, and they named them before they finished them. Holt Row, for the big grey who picked the ground and went through a floor before he could stand on it. Water Street, because Finn dug it. And the Ledge, which is where the ones who came late had to build. Tak had the first roof, which leaked. Finn laid out the water with a girl from Dre called Wick who had come up to look and stayed 9 years, and got it wrong twice and right on the 3rd attempt, and the 3rd attempt is still running. Seniver's brother Olin went up from the Ember yard to cut stone for them and stayed, and married one of them, a quiet one called Isk, whose first child they called Halt over Olin's objection. And that was the first of 7 such marriages and the beginning of a great deal of shouting in Tallow that has since stopped. Most of the shouting was about one question, and it was not a delicate one, and Tak settled it in the market by offering to answer it in full for anybody who stood him a drink. He was answering it for 6 weeks. Umber made him stop, and not because it was coarse. He was giving away for a mug of beer the one piece of information in this valley that nobody else could copy, and she told him so in front of the ladle, and took her commission on the ones already done. They elected nobody. What they did instead was worse for me, and it was cleverer than anything I had built, and I did not see it coming at all. Because 260 people who all hold claims against the same house, and who all live on 3 streets, and who all know exactly what everybody else is holding, do not need coins to trade with each other. Tak would roof Finn's house against Finn digging Tak's drain, and neither of them would touch a quarter claim, and by the 2nd winter there was a whole economy on that flat running on nothing but what everybody remembered about everybody else. I did not notice for 8 months because the numbers looked wonderful. Claims were not coming back for redemption. My paper was staying out in the world, which in my trade looks exactly like success. Isk was the one who put it to me, in her own doorway, with a child on her hip, in about 4 sentences. We do not use your coin here. Why would we? We know what each of us is good for. Your coin is for buying things in Tallow, which means that the 9 is holding nothing of mine but what it needs for the road down. She said yes. Is that a problem? I told her it was not, and walked back down to Tallow and sat in the yard for 2 hours. Because it is the whole thing, and it took a stonecutter's wife in a doorway to say it. They had reinvented the naming. Not the mountain kind. The ordinary kind, where a town knows who is good for what and does not require a stranger's stamp to prove it, which is what my whole trade is a substitute for, and which is what my whole trade is competing against, and which is free. The house lives in the gap between people who trust each other and people who do not. 3 streets is inside the gap, 9 towns and 4 mountains is outside it. That is the entire business, and there is nothing else in it. Umber said the same thing in one sentence when I brought it to her, because she had been watching it happen for a year and had assumed I could see it. You are only ever needed by strangers. Did you really not know that? Kel had a house on the 2nd street and did not live in it. He was in tallow most nights by then, at the door of a place that had already begun to fail, and when I put it to him he said that the 9 did not need him and did not owe him anything, and that this was a fine thing to have built and a poor thing to be inside. Thessarian made one more move that spring, and it was the cleverest thing she ever did, and she did it with a 16-year-old in a road. She started paying the 640 in cattle and grass and roofs, which cost her nothing she had ever valued. And then she had Inno work out what the 640 were spending in tallow, which was nearly everything, because a valley full of beef still needs coats and pots and nails. So she opened a road, 2 miles of graded track from her lower valleys to the low gate, built by her own people in 9 weeks under a foreman of hers called Bry, and no toll on it. Tallow calls it the cattle road and she has never once called it anything. Every penny those 640 earned came into my town and went out again through my streets, and every one of them named Grieve every morning, and she paid for none of it in metal, and her count rose all that year faster than it had risen when she was my largest depositor. She had learned the whole trade off me in 4 years, and what she had learned best was the thing I had never quite put into words, which is that the traffic matters and the money never did. Urin said it in the yard when we saw the road going in. She is going to be the 2nd house before you are the 1st. She was wrong, but only about which of them it would be. That is what I had, at the end of that winter. 260 mouths, of which perhaps 100 were any use, and 13,000 coins in a box that were now worth nothing to me, because a coin is only worth what it can buy, and the only thing I had ever bought with it was mouths. Urin came up the ridgeway in the middle of it and did not shout at me, which was worse. She sat in Doran's yard and worked through it herself, out loud, in the flat quick way she has, and arrived where I had arrived 2 days before. Your metal is fine. Your mark is fine. You have simply run out of people willing to open their mouths, and there is exactly one creature alive who can put 600 of them back, and she will not. And what do you intend to do about it? I laid it out, and she went very still, which is how she thinks. Here is the move. It is the best thing I ever built and it is the thing I would take back. The 260 who stayed had loans against future naming. That was already the arrangement. What I did that winter was turn it round and make the loan the product. A claim backed by nothing in the box at all. Backed instead by the holder's own work, the naming he would give over the next 4 years, valued now, paid now, spendable in tallow today for flour and roof timber in Merritt's coats. The farmers took them, because the house honored them, and the house honored them because the house always had. It worked inside a fortnight. It worked so well that by spring the 260 were better housed than the 600 who had gone to Thessarian, because a cow is a cow but a claim buys a roof and a mill share. And the security on every one of those claims was a person. I understood it while I was doing it. I need that written down plainly, because I have heard it explained since as a thing that crept up on me. It did not creep. I built it on purpose in 9 days with a clear head. If a man does not pay, the claims come home, and the right goes with them, and he goes back under the threshold. The house holds a lien on 260 faces. Doran came to the yard gate at the end of that spring with both dies in her apron, and she did not shout, and she did not stay long. She had the sister in one hand and the 9 in the other, and she put them down on her own block, in her own yard, and stepped back from them. What do you think you are doing? You are lending against people. Not their work. Them. What happens to Tak if he breaks a leg? If Tak breaks a leg in the spring, you take his face off him, and you will do it, because if you do not do it once, the paper stops working. That is the collateral, and the collateral is what makes the loan possible, and without it 260 people freeze. I know all of that. I have known all of that for a month. I am not telling you that you are wrong. I am telling you that you have built a market in faces and that I made every coin in it with my own hands. Then came the piece I did not have an answer for, and I have looked for one for years. When I named you the price, I took the die because I wanted the one thing in this that could refuse. And it has not refused once. Not about Vask. Not about the 900. Not about this. So the die is not doing what I bought it for, and I would rather not own it than own it and keep quiet. I offered her money. I want to be honest about that too. I stood in her grandmother's yard and offered a woman a fifth share, and she looked at me the way you look at a man who has just proved your point for you. She left Tallow at the end of that week. She went down to Caro to work brass, which she had always held was honest, and she took nothing but her tools and Winter, who by then was the oldest goat in the 6 valleys and belonged to nobody. I gave the block to a founder called Perrin, who came up from Westerfold with an apprentice named Nib and a wife who did not want to come, and who was quick, careful, thorough, and would strike anything I put in front of him without a single question, and who I chose for exactly that reason and knew it at the time. The house had no breaks after that. Not one. And down in Ashland a quiet man had spent 2 years buying my discs half a penny over face, and by the summer he was holding a fifth of everything the 9 strokes had ever promised. Osric came up the Ridgeway in the second week of that summer, in the same good coat, and he brought his own box, and he set it on Perrin's block and opened it. I had never seen how many he had. That is the thing about a man who buys quietly for 2 years. There is no morning where you notice. 900 whole claims and something over 11,000 quarters, sorted by die, the Vask forgeries in their own tray, everything counted and stacked in fours the way they do it at the weighing in Caro. He wanted a merger. 2 houses into one, both marks honored, his open hand and my 9 strokes side by side, and the whole of the Saltway and the 6 valleys under a single roof. I did the arithmetic while he was still describing the advantages, because that is what I do instead of listening properly, and it came out at a little over a fifth of everything the 9 strokes had ever promised. A fifth of the world. In one box, on a block in a yard in Tallow, 4 feet from my hand. Now I want to describe exactly what he did next, because it was nothing, and the nothing is the whole man. He did not threaten me. He did not mention the number, then or ever. He closed the box, and he asked after Kell's knees, and he left the proposal with me, and there was no hurry at all. There was no hurry. That is what I could not get out of my head for the rest of that year. A man who is holding a fifth of your obligations does not need a single thing to happen quickly. I offered to buy them back at a premium that evening. Half a penny over what he had paid, which would have been the best trade of his life on any ordinary morning. He thanked me and declined, and he did it so pleasantly that it took me until I was halfway down the lane to understand that I had just told him, in the plainest possible terms, that I knew. I spent 11 days looking for a way at him. He had no hoard. He had no mountain. He had no family in Caro that anybody could find, and he had bought his house on the Ashland Road from a widow named Sab who remembered nothing about him except that he paid in saltweight and was very polite. He had no vice. He drank 1 cup. He did not gamble in a town where everybody gambles. He had a carter called Rutt who had worked for him 9 years and had nothing bad to say, and a die-maker at turn called Evo Lask who had cut his open hand and could not tell me one thing about the man who ordered it and, when pressed, had nothing at all to say, which I noticed and did nothing about. And he had the thing that I could not make any use of, which I first saw at the end of a night in Ashland when we had been at his table since noon. He had not changed. I have sat across tables from men for 20 years. By the 11th hour a face has moved. The mouth goes slack, the eyes get pink, something under the jaw gives up. I looked like a dug field. Rutt was asleep in the corner. Osric at midnight was Osric at noon. Not fresh. Not tired. The same, in the way a painted thing is the same. I put it down to temperament, wrote it in the part of my head where I keep facts I have no use for, and went home. And it sat there for 2 more years being the single most important thing I knew and doing nothing at all. What I did instead was start printing quietly. The screen needed feeding. The wage-backed claims worked, and the more of them I struck the more the 6 valleys could carry, and Perrin struck whatever I put in front of him and never once looked up. And the metal went out of the box. Nobody outside the trade understands this, so let me put it plainly. Dragons never came for the gold. A dragon holding a claim has exactly what he wants and would be a fool to swap it for a lump of metal he then has to get somebody to name. People come for the gold. A farmer in Narrow Ford holding 40 quarters wants coin, because coin buys an ox in a town where the mark means nothing. Every winter the human end of it drained me, and I never once put the 2 counts on the same page until that summer, and when I did it alone, at night, and I did not show it to Urin, or to Kell, or to Umber, or to anyone. 14,760 in the box, once. 5,210 that August. Against a little over 19,000 claims walking around in the world. I started keeping that number on a scrap in my boot, and I want to be clear that a man who keeps a number in his boot has already decided not to be talked out of anything. Yirin came for her medal in September, and she came with 11 carts. I understood as soon as I saw the carts, because you do not bring 11 carts to a conversation. She had come to empty the box and she had come with the means to carry it, and she was in our shape, and she did not sit down. 4,000 coins of brand. I want them on the road by dark. What has changed? She gave me the truth, which she has always done, and the truth was a man in Ashland. Osric had written to her a courteous letter, no accusation in it anywhere, simply a neighbor's note observing that the house in Tallow appeared to have issued rather more paper than the Six Valleys could account for, and that he mentioned it only because she was so large a depositor and he would want to be told himself. That is the second best move anybody made against me in 9 years. He did not have to lie, he did not have to act, and he did not even have to be right about the numbers. He simply had to be the first person to say them to the one creature large enough to break me by asking politely for her own property. Can you pay it? She said. Yes. Today? Yes. And I did not lie, and I have never lied to Yirin, and it cost me a great deal that day to keep to it. Then the box came out and we counted it in front of her, on the floor of the vein, with Kel holding the lamp and Rut's cart standing in the lane, and there was 5,210 in it, and she watched me count out 4,000 of it and stack it in fours. 1,210 left. Against 19,000 claims. She looked at the stacks for a long time. Then she looked at the little pile that was going to be left behind, and she is very quick, and she got there without any help from me. If I take this, what happens tomorrow? Tomorrow the Saltway hears that Brand pulled out. Then Kern asks. Then every farmer in Marrow Ford with 40 quarters under a floorboard comes up this lane at the same time, and there is 1,200 in the box, and the house is finished by Tuesday. And you would still have paid me? I would have paid you. It was your medal. Now. Here is the argument I made, and it is the best hour's work of my life, and I made it because I had nothing else, and it is the only time I ever used the mechanism on somebody's own body without warning them first. What is your count built on? 4,000 coins. No. Her 4,000 coins had been sitting in an iron box in a dead man's counting house for 2 years doing nothing at all. What had been holding Yirin of Bran up, and lifting her past Vask and past Thessarian, was 300 mouths in 4 towns saying her name every morning because the house paid them to. Take the medal home and put it on your own floor, I told her, and you go back to being a mountain with a heap on it and nobody naming it but 11 households at the 9th day. She did not believe me. She is 400 years old and she has been rich for 3 of them and she has never once had to find out where the rich part comes from. So I asked her to give me 1 day. I sent Kel up the scree that night and the naming for Bran stopped at dawn. All of it, 260 mouths, one morning, and every one of them told exactly why, because I was not going to do that to her behind a curtain. She felt it by noon. I was watching her when it happened, in the yard, and it was the hand again, the way it had been with Thessarian in the hall, except that Yirin is young and has no practice at hiding it. Her whole left side went wrong for about 4 seconds and she put her back against the wall. That is 1 day out of 300 mouths. Take the carts home and it is every day. She stood against that wall for a while. Then she started to laugh, which I had not expected at all, and it was not a nice laugh, and what she said when she stopped was fair. So the poor hold me up. And you hold the poor. And I have been walking around for 2 years thinking I was the 3rd largest thing on this continent. She sent the carts back empty. Then she named her price for staying, and it was a good price and I paid it, and it changed everything about the shape of the house. She wanted to see the box. Not once. Whenever she chose, without notice, with her own eyes, and she wanted the number of claims outstanding read to her at the same time. I had been the only creature alive who knew both numbers. From that September there were 2 of us, and the second one was a rival of my largest depositor, and I have never been able to decide whether that was the day the house started dying or the day it got its first chance to live. Yirin came without notice 3 times that year, which was the arrangement, and I have never been so glad of anything I agreed to under duress. The first time she came at harvest and brought her own counter, a dry woman from Bran called Bella who had been doing her herds for 90 years, and the 2 of them counted the box coin by coin on the floor of the vein, with Kel holding the lamp and me reading her the claims outstanding from memory because there is nothing written down. 4,910 in metal. 19,200 in paper. She did not say anything about it. She stood up, brushed her skirt, and asked me one thing on the doorstep. How long can you carry that? Then she went back to Bran, and I spent 9 days waiting for a cart that did not come. The second time she came in the middle of the night in the second month, which I thought was theater and which was not. She wanted to see what the box looked like when nobody had prepared it, and the honest answer is that it looked exactly the same, because there was nothing to prepare. She asked me one question that night that I did not answer well. Who else knows both numbers? You. Only me? And she let it go, and she should not have, because the true answer was that I had started keeping a private count on a scrap of paper in my boot 4 months earlier, and the number on the scrap was not the number I had read out to her from memory, and the difference was about 1,100 quarters that I had struck for the scree between her visits. Not stolen. Not hidden in any way that would survive a proper look, simply not mentioned, because mentioning it would have started a conversation I did not have time for in a month when 30 households in Marrow Ford were being fed on it. That is how it happens. Nobody in this trade decides to deceive anybody. You are busy, and the number is going to be better next month, and you say the number from last month because it is true enough and because the conversation costs a day you do not have. The third audit was in the spring and it was the one that mattered, and she brought Anno. I want to be clear about how that felt. The Syrian's counter, 16 years old, who had grown up carrying my messages up and down that mountain, standing in my own counting house on behalf of my largest depositor's largest rival. He was very polite. He was also faster than me, which I had not expected and should have, since he had learned it in a room where nobody had ever needed to explain anything twice. He found the 1,100 in about 2 hours. He did not find the scrap in my boot, and he did not need to, because he simply counted the scree's wage claims against the scree's names and the two did not agree. Yiren did not accuse me of anything. She has never once raised her voice at me either, and I have noticed that the two creatures in this story who could have eaten me both had better manners than the town did. What she did was change the arrangement. From that spring the claims outstanding were counted by Enno, not read out by me, and the number went to her and to Thessarian on the same day, and I was not permitted to see it first. That is the day I stopped being the only person who knew what the house was, and it is also the day the house became something that could survive me, and I did not enjoy a single minute of it. Kel was there for all 3 of those counts, holding the lamp. He never said a word during any of them. On the road home from the third one he put it to me in the plain way. Was the number you read out at harvest the true one? No. He walked about 100 yards without saying anything. And would you have gone to Yiren if Enno had not found it? I gave him the truth, which is that I would have gone to her when the 1,100 had been earned back and not before, and that in my trade this is so ordinary that it does not have a name. It has a name. He did not say the name. He has never said it. He simply did not come to the yard for about a month, and when he came back he did not mention it, and it has been sitting between us for 6 years, and it is the reason he put it to me on the 3rd day of the run, whether I was coming to him as a friend. The winnowing came the following spring, and it came to nothing, and the nothing was the largest thing that had happened to their kind in 10,000 years. It comes every 9th spring. They gather at the Larn, because the Larn is bare and central and belongs to nobody now, and the hoardless are brought in, and the law does what the law does. There were no hoardless. 906 of them had claims. 640 of those were living in Thessarian's lower valleys with cattle, and 260 were in tallow and coats, and every single one of them had a right standing in his name. So 400 dragons came to the Larn in the first week of spring to carry out a law with nothing left to do, and they stood about on a bare mountain in the wind, and it turned into the first gathering of their kind in living memory that was not about killing anybody. I was there because Thessarian sent Enno down with the request, and because Yiren said that if I did not come she would tell everybody the interesting numbers herself. I have never been so frightened in my life. 400 of them. Cass of the Ninefold, who is older than Thessarian and has not spoken since the last age. Bevan, who came in our shape and spent the entire day trying to work out how to sit on rock in a coat. Thol from the coast, who brought his own weather, and Vask, in the fur coat, avoiding me with tremendous energy, and telling anyone who would listen that he had been in the house from the beginning. Nobody had told them what to do with a winnowing that had nothing to take, and so for the first 2 days they did what any 400 creatures do when the reason for the meeting is gone, which is argue about the meeting. Bevan wanted the law kept and the day kept, on the grounds that a law you drop once is a law you have dropped. Ordle of the Fenwater wanted it moved to the Ninefold, which everybody understood to be about seating. Milne of the Dry Coast wanted a fee. Thol wanted it ended and everybody sent home, and had brought a great deal of rain with him to encourage them. Seeth, who was Bevan's sister and who has never agreed with him about anything, wanted it kept and moved and charged for all three. Vask wanted a register of who had lifted whom, which he raised 4 separate times and which nobody supported, because every one of them had worked out that a list of that kind ends with somebody counting their hoard. And on the second afternoon Cass of the Ninefold spoke. She is older than Thessarian. She has not worn our shape since before. The Saltway had a name and she had not used a word in front of a gathering since the age before this one, and when she started 9 of the younger ones went flat to the rock without deciding to. What she wanted was very short. Who holds the right of the 900? Who is holding the right of the 900? And she wanted him produced. I have never been more frightened, and I have been in a lane with a mob in it. They brought me out onto the shoulder of the Larn and I stood in front of 400 of them and answered her, and I answered the way I answer everything, which is with the numbers, because I do not have any other instrument. 906 lifted, 260 on wage claims held against future naming. 640 on cattle and grass under grieve. 19,000 claims outstanding. 1 box. She let me finish. Then, from the middle of that rock, can a man take a face off a dragon? I said yes. I could have hedged it, and I have thought about that a great deal since, and hedging in front of Cass of the Ninefold would have been the last arithmetic error of my life. And have you done it? Not once, and it was true then. And then she said the only other thing she said in 3 days, and she said it to them, not to me, and it went round that mountain and it has been repeated in halls I will never see. Then what is he holding? He is holding what none of us would hand to a brother, and he has held it for 4 years without using it, and that is either the safest arrangement any of us has ever had or the shortest leash any of us has ever worn. Find out which before he dies. There was no vote. They do not vote. 400 of them stood on a bare mountain and thought about it, which took about an hour, and the sound of that is something I will not forget. What came out of it was that 14 of them opened accounts with me in the following month, including Cass, who deposited nothing at all, sent a courier of her own called Reich twice a year, and simply required to be told the numbers, which she has been ever since, including through the years when the numbers were the worst in the world. And Vask went round that gathering for 2 days telling everybody that he had been in the house from the beginning, which was the first useful thing he ever did for me, because about 9 of them believed him and it made the whole business look older than it was. That is the meeting people remember for the gift. It was actually the meeting where their kind decided, without saying so, that the arrangement was going to be permitted to exist. Thessarian did it in the middle of the afternoon, in front of all of them, and she did it beautifully. She stood up on the bare shoulder of the Larn and she talked about the winnowing and how it had come to nothing, and then she called me out by name in front of 400 creatures, and she gave me the north face of Grieve. Not a payment. A gift. The whole north face, the old workings, everything in them, spoken out freely in front of every hoard holder on the continent. There was a noise from 400 throats that I still hear sometimes, and I stood there on that cold rock and understood that she had just killed me, in public, as a gift, and that she had probably been working on it since the morning she stood aside for a dung cart. Because the whole of the house was that I own nothing. Take the north face and I am a man with a hoard, and every claim I have ever issued belongs to a person with an interest, and the mark is worth nothing by nightfall. Refuse it, in front of 400 of them, and I have thrown the Queen's gift back in her face on the open mountain, and they would not even need to be angry with me. They would simply never do business with a creature who does that. I had about 4 heartbeats. What I did was accept it. I said the words, loudly, so that the back of that crowd heard them, and I thanked her, and the roar came again. And then, without any pause at all, before the noise had finished, I gave it to Kel. The whole north face, spoken out freely, from me to Kel, in front of 400 witnesses who had just watched me receive it. There is a particular silence you get when a very large number of very old creatures all have to think at the same time. Kel had not been warned. He was standing 6 feet away in a coat that Merritt had made him, and he took it, because you cannot refuse either, and because he is Kel and the plain thing was the only thing that occurred to him. He held the north face of Grieve for about 9 seconds before he understood what had happened to him. Then he sat down on the rock, hard. Thessarian looked at me across that crowd, and I looked back, and neither of us gave the other one thing. I was still holding nothing. The gift had gone through me like water through a pipe, and every dragon on that mountain had watched it happen, and that is the afternoon they all learned that a right can be handed on faster than it can be refused. I have thought since that I taught the whole world the move that killed the house, in public, for free, because I had 4 heartbeats. It cost me on the way down as well, and it cost me the thing I would least have chosen. Kel worked it out on the ridgeway that evening, walking, with his boots in his hand, the way he does when he is thinking. The north face is worth more than my loan. Yes. A great deal more. Yes. Then I do not owe the house anything. I can clear it tomorrow. He was not being clever. He was doing arithmetic out loud, which is the only kind of arithmetic he does, and he was right, and he cleared it 11 days later down to the last quarter. And the young man who walked into tallow in a sacking coat, whose face had been held on by my signature for 4 years, walked out of my yard that morning owning a mountain and owing me nothing at all. I congratulated him. I meant it. And then I went and sat in the vein for 2 hours, because I had just lost the last person in the world who had to do what I told him, and because down at the bottom of the valley a quiet man from Cairo had spent the whole afternoon at the Larn watching me hand something away to save myself. He waited 19 days after the Larn, which was exactly right, and it is the only thing he ever did that I admire without reservation. 19 days put it 4 days after harvest, when every farmer in the 6 valleys and along the Saltway is holding the year's takings in small money and has not yet spent it. It put it 8 days after Kel cleared his loan, which the whole valley had talked about, because the house's best borrower had walked away and paid everything and never come back. And it put it on a 9th day, when tallow is full. Rut brought the box up the ridgeway on a cart, alone, and set it on the counter of the vein, and gave me a message he had plainly been made to learn by heart, because he stumbled twice. 900 whole claims. 11,040 quarters. Metal, today, at the house, under the mutual honor, with no ceiling. 3,660 coins worth. The box had gone on draining all that year the way it always drained, a farmer at a time, and on the morning Rut's cart came up the ridgeway there was 1,210 in it. I want to be exact about what I felt, because it was not fear. It was recognition. I had been waiting for that cart since the night in Doran's yard when I first counted past the metal, and part of me had been resting badly ever since, and here it was on a 9th day with turnips outside. I offered part payment, 1,200 now, the rest in 90 days, at a premium he could name himself. Rut had been given the answer to that. All of it today, or the house declines in the open. Which is it to be? Did he say anything else? Rut, who had worked for that man for 9 years and had never had a bad word for him, looked at the floor and repeated the rest of it, which was that his master had promised it would be quick. So I declined in the open, because there was nothing else, and because a house that pays half is a house that is lying about the other half. I have to go back 4 hours to tell the rest of it properly. Rel brought the warning at 4 in the morning. Is a strong box a big thing or a small thing? That was how he put it, with his hands still bleeding. He had been at Cobb's Reach on other business, which is to say at the Stone Shoe, which is the inn halfway up the ridgeway where everything in this valley is actually decided. And he had seen Rut loading a cart with a strong box at an hour when nobody loads anything, and he had run the ridgeway in the dark, which is 9 miles of loose stone, and he arrived at the yard with his hands cut open and could not speak for a minute. 4 hours. That is what a boy who once robbed Merritt of 311 quarters bought me, and I used them badly, and I have never told him so. What I did with those 4 hours was count the box again, in case it had changed, and then sit with it. What I should have done was send Kel up to the scree, so that 260 people heard it from us instead of from the road at noon. They heard it from the road at noon. The lane, when it filled in the order I could have written out in advance if I had ever let myself write it. The first ones there were the ones with least. Fitch the carter, with his arm still not right from the grain store, holding 11 quarters. Merritt, a woman from the Embry yard whose name I did not know then and know now, Siniver, with 9. The people with real money came at dusk, and they came quietly, and they stood at the back where they could see the door and not be seen wanting anything. When Prattle got there at 4 and stayed until the following night, and about 8 o'clock he did the thing that saved the town from itself. He started a list at the tally stone of who had come and at what hour, and he told everybody that when the house paid, it would pay in that order, and that anybody who pushed went to the bottom. Nobody had given him the authority to do that. I certainly had not. It held all the same, because 90 people preferred a queue with a rule in it to a queue without one, and because when Prattle has never once been caught out in a lie about fish. Andre Vell came at 9. Is anybody going to be paid tonight? No. Then he did not ask me a single question for the rest of it, which from him was mercy. He put the wardmen on the Embry yard end of the lane, where the fire was, with Kate in front of them, who was the only one of the 6 who had never taken a penny of mine without looking at it first, and he took the two who had stood aside at the grain store and sent them home. Necessor called out from the middle of it, twice, that I had eaten this street once before, and both times somebody near her told her to be quiet, and neither time was it me. Up on the scree they got the news at noon, and by dark they had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic on that heap is not about money. 260 wage claims. If the house declines, the claims are dead, and a dead claim is no right at all, and a person with no right goes back under the threshold. Some of them started walking that night, toward the lower valleys, to be under a roof and near cattle when it happened. About 40 went. Nobody blames them, and Tak, who did not go, has never once let anybody say a word against them in his hearing. The rest sat up on the rock in the cold in their coats and waited to find out what they were going to be in the morning. Umber walked the heap all night. She has never told me what she said to them, and I have never asked. Tak told me years later that she said the same 7 words to everybody, one at a time, right round the whole heap, and that he would not repeat them because they were hers. And Dag came back. He had been in Thessarian's valleys for 11 months with a herd and a house and no obligation to anybody in Tallow. He came up the new road at midnight with 9 others behind him, and he did not come to collect anything, because he had nothing in the house to collect. He stood in that lane until dawn with people who had been shouting at me, and when Necessor called out the second time it was Dag who told her to be quiet. I paid Rudd out the 1210. Every coin in the box. I did it in front of half the street in the doorway of the vein, and I made sure it was in front of them, because if the run was coming I wanted the town to have seen the last of the metal leave rather than imagine it going out the back. That was the most expensive piece of honesty in the history of this trade, and I would still do it. The lane filled by 4 o'clock. I have heard that sound once before in my life. It does not sound like anger. It sounds like a market, and that is the horror of it, because a market is the ordinary noise of people getting on with things, and it means the same thing coming up your steps. When Prattle was near the front with a bag, Tib the cooper had brought his floorboard money in a jug. Merritt had 4 years of coats in quarter claims, and she was crying, which I had never seen and which took something out of me that has not come back. The widow Aubring came at about 6. She had 211 quarters, which is everything the house had ever paid her, and which she had been holding because she believed in it, and she stood in that lane with them in her apron. She did not shout at me. That was the worst of the whole evening. 60 years of shouting at everybody in Tallow, and she stood in front of me and put it quite quietly. Should I have taken the 3 crowns off the mountain when I had the chance? I had nothing. I stood in my own doorway with an empty box behind me, and I told the truth, which is that the house could not pay today, that the metal was gone, and that every disc in that lane was still good, and I did not know when. Half of them stayed in the lane all night. That is a thing I did not expect. They did not break the door, and they did not go home. They stood there, and somebody built a fire in the ember yard, and they waited to see what a man does. Up on the scree it was worse, and it was quieter. 260 of them were carrying wage-backed claims, which is to say their right stood on the house and nothing else, and by dark they had all worked out the same thing at the same time. Tak came down at midnight and found me in the yard and did not make a single joke. Is it over? That was the first thing out of him. How long have I got? A day? A week? That is all. Not whether. How long? I did not have an answer for him either. And at the end of that night Thessarian came down the mountain into the town for the second time in her life, and this time she did not stop to look at anything. She came into the vein at first light with Enno behind her and Kel arriving 4 minutes later at a run. She wanted 3 things and she named them without sitting down. Her 9,000 coins. The standing claim out of my pocket. And her word back, spoken free, so that grief stood behind nothing. The 9,000 is gone. It went out over 4 winters to farmers and carters who wanted metal, and there is nothing in that box, and Rutt took the last of it up the ridgeway yesterday afternoon. She took that without moving. Then she put out her hand for the coin, and I did the hardest thing I have ever done, which was to leave it in my pocket and explain to a creature 10,000 years old why she was not going to be allowed to leave. Because the guarantee does not work the way she thought it worked, and it never had, and she had chosen not to look at it on a warm morning 4 years ago with a man standing in front of her who could have made her look. If grief stands behind the house, then the day the house cannot pay, grief pays. That day is today. 19,000 claims are outstanding and there is no metal, and every one of them is now a call on her. Withdrawing the word does not take her out of it. Withdrawing the word is the thing that fails the house, and failing the house is the thing that triggers her. She could not step out of the queue, because she was the queue. She did not believe me either. Nobody ever believes this part, and I have stopped being surprised by it, because the whole of my trade is that the arrangement is invisible until the morning it is not. So she came across that counter at me. I do not remember deciding anything. No shouted. Kel got between us, which very nearly ended him. She got about half of it out. That is the only way I can describe it. She came at me as a woman and the shape went off her somewhere in the middle of the room, and there was a great deal of grief in the vein for perhaps 2 seconds, and the ceiling went, and then it stopped. It stopped in the middle. She could not hold it. She ended up on the floor of a broken counting house in the shape of a woman of 50 with her hair down and both hands flat on the boards, breathing, in front of a boy, a young man in a coat, and the human who had done it to her. Nobody moved for a while. Then she got up and put her hair back and looked at what was left of the ceiling, and she said the truest sentence anybody has ever said to me, and there was no venom in it at all, which is why it has stayed. You did not trick me. You let me be old at you. Do you know what that is worth, in a room like this? I could have argued. There is a version of that morning where I explain the terms again and point out that she read every line and that a creature 10,000 years old is responsible for her own arithmetic. What I did instead was the only decent thing I did that whole year. I told her that I had seen her measuring the risk in centuries when it was going to arrive in days, that I had known it in the room, that I had 4 sentences ready that would have made her look at it properly, and that I had said none of them because I wanted the 9,000. She listened to all of it. Then she gave me 11 days, which was not mercy and which she was careful to explain was not mercy. 11 days is how long it takes the news to reach the coast. After that every holder in the world comes, and Grieve answers for all of it, and if she is going to be bled she would rather it happened after she has had a chance to watch me try. Fix it, from the doorway of my ruined house. I have nothing better to do for 11 days. She did not spend those 11 days waiting for me. I found out afterward, mostly from Enno, and some of it from Hask, and one piece of it from Cass herself 2 years later in a way I would rather not repeat. On the second day she went to the ninefold. She had not been there since before Tallow had a low gate. She went in her own shape and she asked Cass of the ninefold for 3,660 coins against the north face of Grieve, which she no longer owned, and against the naming of the 6 valleys, which she did. Cass refused her. What she said, in the version that came back to me, was that the Sarian had put her right behind a human's mark of her own free will and that the ninefold did not lend to creatures who had already decided how the story ended. On the 4th day she went to Ashlyn herself. I did not know this for a year. She went down the ridgeway in our shape, in the plain dark dress, and she sat in Osric's small clean room with the fire and the one chair too few, and she offered to buy his entire holding at face. 3,660 coins for paper he had bought at a loss. It would have been the largest single loss any creature on this continent has ever willingly taken, and she would have taken it, and then she would have held the call herself and simply never made it. He was extremely courteous. He offered her tea, which she did not understand. And he declined, and he gave her a reason, and the reason is the only description of him I have ever fully trusted. He told her that he had spent 400 years being the second largest thing in every hall he had ever entered, and that he was not selling the first afternoon of his life, in which that was not true. She came back up the ridgeway that night and did not tell me, and on the 6th day she went into her own lower valleys and did the thing that I did not learn about until the 11th morning when the carts came down. She counted her own herds and her own grain and her own people. Not for me. She was working out what Grief could survive paying, so that when I failed she would know exactly how much of her own promise she could honor before it started taking her apart. Enno has the figures still, in the room at the head of the passage that Hask now calls the counting room and will not go into. She had it worked out to the fortnight. She could pay 9,000 and stay standing. She could pay 11 and lose the lower valleys. Past 13,000 she was a mountain with dust on it and 640 tenants who would name somebody else by spring. That is what she brought down the mountain on the 11th day with the 11 carts. Not faith in me. Not mercy. A number she had checked twice, and the decision that the cheapest thing available to her was to keep her word in daylight in front of the whole town. I did not know any of that when I stood in the mouth of my ruined house and called the guarantee. I have thought since that if I had known, I would have asked for less, and that the town would have been paid at 3 parts in 5, and that Tallow would have spent the following 10 years explaining to itself that the house had cheated it. Not knowing was worth about 4,000 coins to 60 households, and I have never been able to decide whether that makes me lucky or something worse. The morning after the 11 carts, Tallow woke up richer than it had ever been, and it did not know what to do with itself. 9,000 coins of grieve went out over a table in Kettle Row in one afternoon, and by the following week the whole town understood that it was holding real metal for the first time in living memory and that there was nothing in the 6 valleys to spend it on. Harrow Pell sold his grain for gold and could not think of anything to buy with it. Nessa Cor bought a loom from Westerfold that she did not need and has never used. Tib the Cooper bought a horse. Seniver, who had 9 quarters and got 9 coins, wanted to know whether she was allowed to keep them in the house or whether that was greedy, and then put every one of them under a stone and has never touched them, and told me 4 years later that she keeps them because it is proof it happened. And by the 3rd week the price of everything in tallow had gone up again, because that is what happens, and the widow Aubryn went round the market telling everybody it would, and was right, and enjoyed it enormously. Their kind took it differently. Bevan sent word within 9 days offering the house a deposit, which was absurd, since there was no house. Full came up the coast road in person to look at the town where a mountain had paid, and stood in Kettle Row for an hour in his own weather and went away again without a word to anybody. Cass of the Ninefold sent for Thessarion. That conversation I know about because Enno was in the room to read the figures. Cass wanted to establish one thing only. Did she pay because she was made to, or because the word was hers? The answer mattered enormously to them and not at all to us. A creature who pays because she was cornered is a creature who has been beaten by a human. A creature who pays because the word was hers is something they had no word for at all, and they spent about 2 years finding one. What came out of it, eventually, was that 7 of them wrote guarantees of their own. Not to me, to each other, and to 2 of the new houses, and Orne, in the north, which nobody in the 6 valleys had heard of 9 years ago, stands behind a house in Saltmere I have never visited. That is what my 9 years actually produced, and it is not the thing I was trying to produce, and I have made my peace with it. Osric never came back for the block. He took the dies and the box and the paper south on a cart with Rutt driving, and Rutt came back alone 11 days later and asked Perrin for work, and got it, and worked at that block for 6 years and never once said his old master's name in the yard. Vask turned up in tallow the following spring to explain to anybody who would listen that he had seen the whole thing coming. He is the only creature in this story whose position at the end was exactly what it was at the start, and I have thought about that more than is healthy. And on the 9th day after the carts, Andrivel came to my yard with the question he had brought 4 years earlier and put away politely when I called it a long way off. What happens in the 4th year if the mountain has stopped paying and the town has not stopped being owed? I told him that we had just found out, and that the answer was that the mountain pays, once, in daylight, and then the arrangement is over and everybody starts again poorer and wiser. Do you intend to build it so that the same thing can happen twice? No. Then he told me what he wanted, and he had clearly been composing it since the grain store, and it is the reason the 2nd house is shaped the way it is. He wanted the wardmen off my payroll and onto the towns, out of my money, at whatever it cost. He wanted the naming terms capped at 2 years instead of 4. And he wanted one man in tallow, not chosen by me, who could look at the numbers whenever he liked and tell anybody who asked. That man is Win Prattle, who cannot count past a fish and who has never once been caught out in a lie. Tallow calls it the first telling, because Nessa Cor called it that once as an insult and it stuck, and who comes into the yard on the 1st of every month and has the numbers read to him, and who then goes and stands at the tally stone and says them out loud to whoever is there. It is the least efficient arrangement in the history of banking. It has held for 4 years and I have stopped arguing about it. I spent the first days of those 11 trying to find 3,660 coins, and I want to put down what I tried, because the story is usually told as though I sat in a yard and had an idea. I went to Yurin first, on the 2nd morning, and she was the easiest to ask and the hardest to hear. She has 4,000 of her own on Bran and she could have covered the whole call twice. She listened to the proposal, which was a loan against the 2nd house at a rate that would have made her the largest creature on this continent inside a decade. Then she took me out into the yard and gave me the arithmetic, and it was mine, and she had learned it from me. If she puts 4,000 into a house that is being called by a holder of a fifth of it, the 4,000 goes straight out to that holder and the house is exactly where it was at dusk. Nothing about the call goes away. The only difference is that Bran is inside the hole instead of outside it. You do not lend to stop a run. You lend to stop a shortage, and this is not a shortage. She was right and I have taught it to 2 people since. I went to Kell on the 3rd day, and that was worse, because he wanted to say yes. He had the north face. He could have sold a working to Bevan inside a week and covered half the call, and he had the papers out on Merritt's table when I got there, and he had been up all night with them. And then he did the arithmetic out loud, the way he does, and got to the end of it before I did. Half is not the call. Half is a house that declines tomorrow instead of today, with the north face gone as well. Then he asked me a question that took the floor out from under me, and he asked it plainly, with no edge in it at all, because there is never any edge in him. He wanted to know whether I was asking him as a friend or as a man who had given him the north face 3 weeks ago to save the house, and who might reasonably feel that it was owed back. I have never been asked a straighter question. The truth was that I did not know, and that I had been careful not to find out, and that is what he got. He did not sell the working. He came to the lane anyway on the 11th day and did the largest thing anybody did in this whole story, and he did it as a free man who owed me nothing, which is the only reason it was worth anything. On the 5th day I went south to Caro, and Hesper Bly saw me inside an hour, which after 4 years of the weighing ignoring me was itself a piece of news. She had the whole thing already. 3/5 of the salt houses in that city had bought tallow quarters at a discount off Carter's in the spring, which I had not known, and the weighing had been watching my mark the way you watch weather at sea. She would not lend. She explained why without unkindness, and she used one sentence. We do not put salt behind gold that is behind nothing. Would you? Then she told me the thing I had gone there for without knowing it, which is that the weighing had been approached in the spring, twice, by a quiet man from Ashland, asking on what terms they would honor a mark that was not his own if the house behind it failed. He had been arranging the aftermath before he called the loan. That is when I stopped thinking of Osric as a competitor and started understanding what I was actually looking at, which is a creature that had 400 years to be patient in and had spent all of it. Ansel Roque got me drunk that night in the Bell Yard and told me Doran was in the city and would not see me, and that she had asked after talk and not after me, and that she had said one thing about the whole business which he repeated because he thought it was funny, that I would find a way to be the only one still standing, and that she hoped it would cost me something this time. I had one thing, and it had been sitting in my head for 2 years doing nothing, and I had never once been desperate enough to look at it properly. A man whose face does not get tired at midnight. Here is what I knew and had never put together. Osric had no hoard, no mountain, no family, no vice, and no hunger. He had a carter who had worked for him 9 years and could not tell you one thing about him. He had understood the whole mechanism in the same spring I had, from Ashland, without ever seeing my box. And he had bought 1/5 of my paper over 4 years at a loss on every single disc, which no man building a business would ever do, and which is exactly what something building a position would do. Kell drove me down to Ashland. He did not have to, and he owed me nothing, and I have never asked him why he came. On the road I worked out how to test it, and the test is the same instrument as everything else in this story, which is the only reason I trusted it. Nothing in this world does anything to a man. You can name a human owner of a hoard all day and he stays exactly what he is. But you cannot name a dragon an owner without it landing on him, and you cannot name one against his will without him minding a very great deal. So I did not accuse him of anything. I sat in his front room with the small clean fire and the one chair too few, and after we had talked about the run for an hour, I looked at the box on his table and I said it, flat, the way I had said it on a rock to Kell 4 years before. The metal in that box is Osric's, and I say so freely. He came out of the chair. I have replayed it 100 times and it is still the fastest thing I have ever seen a person do. Not a flinch. Not an objection. He was across that room with his hand up before the last word was properly out of me, and what he said, and he said it before he had control of it, was 3 words. Do not. What do you think you are doing? A man does not care. A man would have laughed, or thanked me, or asked what game I was playing. There is no version of a human being in that room who crosses the floor in half a second to stop a bankrupt saying a sentence about his own money. He got it back at once. He apologized. He explained, pleasantly and at length, that his position depended on strict neutrality and that even a joke about ownership was unhelpful in a house like his, and every word of it was true, and none of it was why. I let him finish and I did not say anything else about it, and we parted very warmly, and he saw me to the gate. Then I went round to the yard and found Rut with the horses and asked him one question, and it was not about his master's business, and he answered it without thinking because it was such a small thing. In 9 years, had he ever seen Osric eat? He stood there with a bucket in his hand and got about halfway into an answer and then stopped, and I watched a decent man's face do something I have only seen a few times, which is a whole life rearranging itself while you look at it. Not once. That is strange, is it not? It sounds strange when you say it out loud. Kell had it before I was back in the cart, because he does not have to work things out, he simply has no way of not saying what is in front of him. He is a dragon, and he has been buying our paper for 4 years, and he has no hoard because he gave up his hoard, and there is only one thing in the world you would do that for. Not the gold. He had never wanted the gold. He had wanted the only position in this world that 10,000 years of his own kind could not occupy, and I had built it, described it in public, and put a working example of it on the ridgeway for him to study. I had 11 days. I had no medal, no partner, no die of my own, one queen with a broken ceiling, and the truth about a man that I could not do a single useful thing with. Although at the time, driving up that road in the dark, I was entirely certain that I could. I told everybody. That was my plan. I had the truth about the man who had broken me, and I carried it around 3 valleys in 4 days like a jug I was afraid of spilling. I told the lane first, standing on my own step, with the fire still going in the Ember yard and 200 people who had been there since the run began. The man in Ashland who called in every claim at once is a dragon. He gave up his own hoard to do it. He has been buying your small money for 4 years to get to this morning. They heard me out. They were decent about it. And then when Prattle, who is not a cruel man, asked the only question that anybody in that lane actually had. That is very interesting. Where is my medal? I did not have an answer, and so the truth sat there in the middle of the lane doing nothing at all, and after a while people went back to the fire. The widow Aubryn put it to me straight when I tried it on her a second time. Do I look as though I care what he is? I gave you 211 quarters and you have given me a story about a dragon. It went worse with their kind, and it went worse in a way I had not imagined even once. I sent Eno to Bran and I went myself to Kern, and I stood in Vask's hall and gave him the whole thing, expecting outrage, and Vask listened to about half of it and then began, visibly, to be impressed. Because think about what it sounds like from a horde. A creature who gave up his gold, who has held our shape unbroken for 4 centuries, who cannot be bought because he owns nothing and cannot be starved because he has already starved. 3 of them tried to open accounts with him inside a fortnight. Cass of the Ninefold, who had not spoken since the last age, sent word to Ashland, and I know that because the word went through Eno, who could not look at me when he came back. To me he was a fraud. To 400 of them he was the first of their kind ever to find a way out of the trap they had all been sitting in since before there were people, and I was the bankrupt human telling tales about him. And Yurin, who had every reason to be on my side and who was on my side, came up the ridgeway on the 6th day to point out the thing I had entirely failed to see. You have just announced to the whole world that the position can be taken, that any one of us can put down a horde and become the house. Do you understand what you have done to the mark? Not his. Yours. Every one of them is now looking at your box and wondering who else is in there. Osric said nothing at all. That was his answer to 4 days of me. He did not deny it, he did not confirm it, he did not send Rudd up the road with a letter. On the 7th day he offered, publicly and courteously, to honor every tallow quarter claim at his own house in Ashland at 3 parts in 5. 3/5 of face is a robbery. It is also 3/5 more than the nothing they had from me, and it was in metal, and by the 9th day there were carts going south out of the 6 valleys every hour. Perrin stopped striking on the 8th day. He did it apologetically. He was a good founder and he had a family and there was no work. Quarter claims traded at about 1/3 in the Ember yard that week, when they traded at all. My mark, which had been the only thing in the world holding up 906 people, was worth less than the metal in it. On the 8th day I tried the last thing, and it was the worst idea I have ever had, and I got 2 hours into it before Umber stopped me. I was going to call the naming. 260 on the Scree, and 640 in Thessarian's valleys, and 1100 mouths in the towns. If they all stopped naming Grieve on the same morning, the mountain would be in real trouble inside a week, and a mountain in real trouble might find 3,600 coins very quickly. I had it half arranged. I had spoken to Tak. I had a route worked out through Rel and the couriers, and it would have worked, and it would have taken about 9 days to bring the largest creature on this continent to the point of paying anything I asked. Umber came down off the heap and put her head in front of mine in the yard and asked me one question. What is it you are actually selling, in the end, when everything else is gone? Say it. The mark. No. The mark is a piece of stamped metal. What you sell is that when you say a thing about who owns what, it is true. That is the entire good. You have nothing else, you have never had anything else, and you are about to use it as a weapon. I sat down on Doran's old block and did not get up for a while, because she was right, and because the terrible thing about it was that it would have worked, and because a man who will use the naming as a knife once is a man whose naming is a knife forever, and every dragon on this continent would have understood that by the following spring. I called it off that night. Tak was disappointed. He had been looking forward to it enormously. And then there were 3 days left, and I had tried alone, a sail, a city, and a siege, and the only thing left in my pocket was one coin that said the largest hoard alive stood behind a mark that was worth nothing. Which is the point at which you stop asking how to save a house and start asking what a dying house still owns that nobody else can hold. Umber found me on the 10th night in the ruin of the vein, under a ceiling with a hole in it, and gave me the thing I needed and did not want. You tried to win with a fact. Yes. And what did the fact buy you? They do not want a fact. They want a coin, or a face, or a roof. You have known that since the first morning on our rock, and you forgot it the moment you had something clever. Then she asked what I actually had left, and made me name it out loud, item by item, which is the oldest trick in my own trade, and I did not notice her doing it. An empty box. A dead mark. A die I do not own, in the hands of a founder who has stopped 260 people whose faces come off in a fortnight. One queen who has given me until tomorrow and who cannot leave. And one coin in my pocket that says the largest hoard alive stands behind all of it. Say the last one again, Umber said. I did not sleep. I sat in that yard with the standing claim in my hand and did the arithmetic the other way round for the first time in 9 years, which is to say I stopped asking how to save the house and started asking what the house could still be used for while it was dying. And it turned out that a dying house owns exactly one thing worth having, and it is the only thing in this world that a certain kind of creature is physically unable to refuse. We did it in the lane on the 11th day, and it took most of the afternoon, and I want to set it down in order because the order is the whole of it. First I called the guarantee. The Sarian came down at noon with Hask and Inno and 11 carts behind her, and I stood in the mouth of my own ruined house with 200 people watching and required the mountain to pay. Grieve stands behind the mark of Merrick of the vein. The mark cannot pay. Grieve pays. She had known since dawn. She had brought the carts. There was still a moment where she stood in the lane with her jaw set and every hoard holder's instinct in 10,000 years telling her to burn the town instead, and it lasted about 4 seconds, and I counted them. Then she paid. 9,000 coins of grief came off that mountain in daylight and went out over a table in Kettle Row, to Merritt, to Tib, to Win Prattle, to 60 households and 11 towns, at full face, in metal, on the word she had given on a road 4 years earlier when she thought it was a formality. The widow Aubryn got 211 quarters worth of gold counted into her apron by the Queen of Dragons, and did not thank her, and I have never been prouder of anyone in my life. That is the payment the whole of this began with, and I want to be plain about what it was. It was not a gift and it was not mercy. It was a debt, called in public, on a promise she had made freely and read every line of, and paid to people she had never once looked at. Second, Kell divided the north face. He had been standing at the back of the lane all morning in the coat Merritt made him. When it was time he came out and did it in about 90 seconds, without notes, because he had spent the night before making certain he had the number right. 260 shares of the north face of Grieve, spoken out freely, to the 260 on the scree whose right had been standing on my mark and would be worthless by nightfall. He kept nothing. Not a slope, not a working, not one coin of it. It is the single largest thing anybody has ever given away on this continent, and it was done by a young man in sacking who could not walk 4 steps without falling over 5 years earlier. And he did it because he had worked out that it was the plain thing to do and had no mechanism for doing anything else. 260 of them became owners in the middle of a lane in Tallow. Tak owns a hill. Sarn came up from the lower valleys for it, and stood at the back, and did not use a word. Third, Osric came. He came because Rudd had brought him word about the carts, and because a man who has waited 4 years for a position does not stay in Ashland on the afternoon it falls vacant. He came in the good coat, on foot, up the ridgeway, alone. He was very gracious about it. He said the thing that people in our trade say, which is that he was sorry it had gone this way and that he would take on what he could of my obligations, and he was already looking past me at Perrin's block. I gave him the house. The die and the sister, out of Perrin's hands. The empty box out of the vein. The mark itself, the 9 strokes, everything they had ever meant and everything they might mean again. And the standing claim. Grief's word, the promise that the largest hoard alive answers for the mark, which had just been called once and which still had every one of its remaining days in it. All of it, from me to Osric of Ashland, spoken out freely. He understood at about the middle of that sentence. I watched it arrive. He put a hand out, the way he had come across his own front room, and I saw him try to find the shape of a refusal and fail, because there has never been one. And the lane said it with me. That was the part he could not have stopped even if he had known it was coming. 200 people in Kettle Row, and 260 new owners with the North Face still warm in their names, and Umber, and Urin, and Thessarian of Grieve, all of them naming him, freely, at once, out loud, that the house is his. That the mark is his. That the box, the dies, the debts, the guarantee, and every disc the 9 strokes ever promised belonged to Osric, sometimes called Havoc, of No Mountain. He took it. He could not do otherwise. I have never been able to feel much about that, because it is exactly like watching a man drown who cannot stop swallowing. And the moment it landed, the whole of it died in his hands. 900 whole claims. 11,040 quarters. 4 years of buying at a loss, half a penny at a time, out of the pockets of Carters and Ashland, the largest holding of paper in the history of this world. Every one of them are right against the house. And he was the house. There is no naming yourself. It is the first thing any of them learns and the last thing this one remembered. A right you hold against your own hand is not a right, it is a lump of stamped metal, and there is not a mouth in creation that can make it into anything else. He stood in Kettle Row holding the position he had given up a mountain for, and he had it, entirely, and it was worth nothing at all, and he was the only person in that lane who had understood it before I finished speaking. The last thing he did was not undignified. I want that on the record, because I have heard the story told with him howling and he did not howl. He asked me, quite quietly, whether I had worked it out at the Larn. He got the truth. I had worked out the shape of it at the Larn, with 4 heartbeats to spare, when I gave a mountain to Kell to keep from owning it. He had watched me do it and had not seen what it was, and neither had I, and it took me 29 days and a run to look at it again. He nodded. Then he went south along the Farrant Road with the box and the dies and the largest dead hoard of paper anybody has ever assembled, and as far as I know he is still sitting on it. He is what all of them were for 10,000 years, a creature with everything, and not one right in it that belongs to anybody else. The only difference between Osric and the whole history of his kind is that they took 10,000 years to arrive there and he did it between noon and dusk on a 9th day. Here is what was left the next morning. No mark. No die. No box, no metal, no house, no partner, and 19,000 discs in the world that were formerly worth their weight and nothing more. And 2 things nobody could take, and I did not see either of them until Umber pointed at the second one. The first was that the 6 valleys and the Saltway had been paid in full, in metal, on time, by the guarantee. Not one holder who kept his paper lost a penny, and the ones who had sold south at 3/5 paid 2 parts in 5 for the comfort of not waiting. That has never happened in the collapse of any house anywhere. And it happened because a creature 10,000 years old kept her word on a bad day. The second was that 1,100 people in 4 towns had spent 4 years learning that their mouths were worth money. That does not go back in the box. That is what I had failed to understand when I stood in Doran's yard telling her we were buying 2 pennies and now 4. The thing I had built was never the metal or the mark. It was that a farmer in Marrow Ford knows what he is holding when he opens his mouth, and no house failing anywhere changes that. So I started again 11 days later, on Perrin's block, with a borrowed hammer, and this time I did not pretend. The new claims have nothing behind them. No box, no hoard, no metal, no guarantee. What they carry is the naming itself, bought forward and sold on, and the only thing that makes one good is that somebody will take it, which is the only thing that ever made one good. I put that on the coin. Not a number. For words, cut small, and the second house has issued nothing since without them. Doran came back from Cairo in the spring. She had heard the whole thing in the bell yard from a brass man who had it from Rut. She walked into the yard with the sister in her apron, because the sister had been in her apron in Cairo the entire time and Osric had gone south with a die and a copy that she had quietly kept the better of. She had one condition and she made me agree to it standing up, in front of Cal and Umber, with the fire going. She says no, out loud, in public, whenever she likes, about anything, and no share and no fifth and no partnership will ever be offered to her again, because the last time she took the price she asked for it bought her silence and she did not notice for 4 years. I agreed. She has used it 7 times since. Twice I was right and she was wrong, and both times she was still correct to have said it. The second house had its own run in the 3rd year, and it was not ours. And what we did about it is the only thing in 9 years that I am straightforwardly proud of. The house at Saltmere belonged to Marrow CASP, who had kept Bruce Sallow's counter for 6 years and set up on his own with 200 coins and an open hand cut by a die maker in turn called Evo Lask. He was not a fraud. He was 31 and quick and he lent 4 years of naming against a herring fleet, and the fleet had a bad autumn, and by the first frost Saltmere had a queue. Bruce Sallow sent a courier up the 9-day post with one line on it. Will you honor CASB's paper? Nobody had ever asked that before. There is no arrangement in this world that requires one house to stand behind another's mistake, and there never was, and the whole trade said no with one voice, including Urin, who wrote from Dre to tell me exactly why. If you pay for CASB's bad lending, every house on this coast lends badly, because the cost lands on you. She was right. It is the correct answer and it is in every book that has been written since, and I did the other thing. I want to set out why, because it was not kindness and it was not clever. I had watched a town called Tallow Q in Elaine for 2 nights. I knew what those weeks in Saltmere were going to look like, and I knew that when it was over the word on that coast would not be CASP failed. The word would be that the open hand and the 9 strokes both failed, because to a woman with 9 coins under a stone they are the same thing wearing different marks. So I paid it. Every Saltmere coin, at face, at our door in Tallow, for as long as anyone brought them. We had no box. Nobody in Caro believed that for a year. We honored another house's paper out of a building with nothing in it but a block and a hammer, and the way we did it was to buy the naming forward off 9 towns and sell it to Bevan and Cass, and it took 11 months and we came out of it thin. Narrow CASP came up the ridgeway in the spring to hand me his die. Why would I want it? I would not take it. What do you want instead? I could not think of anything, and Umber, who was in the yard, gave him the answer. Come back in 10 years and do it for somebody else. Is that a price or is it not? He runs 3 doors on that coast now and he has done it twice, once for a house in turn and once for Evo Lask's daughter, and neither of them has ever met me. That is the whole of what I built, and it is not a bank. For days after the last Saltmere coin was paid, Hesper Bly wrote her 4 lines from the weighing, and the weighing took the mark, and every house on that coast could suddenly settle in Caro inside an afternoon instead of 9 days up a mountain road. Doran read the letter twice and put it down and said the only sentimental thing I have ever heard from her. Your father would not have understood one word of this. He would not. He counted the walk with me on the step of a house he lost, every autumn, and never once told me why. And I have come to think that he did not know why either, and that some habits are just an ache with a number attached. 9 days when I was a boy. 1 afternoon when I was 38. 6 days last autumn, and Hask complaining the whole way. I have one more thing to put down and then I am finished. Kel came to the yard on the first morning of this spring and asked me for the last thing I expected, which was the 2-year term, in his own name, on the 9. He does not need it. He has a house on the 2nd Street and he owns nothing and he has never once been under the threshold since the day I gave him the north face and he gave it away. Why? Because everybody else on those 3 streets is on it, he said, and it is easier to be inside a thing than beside it, and I have been beside things for 9 years. So the first name on the new roll is the first name that was ever on the old one, and he did not do it to be neat, because it did not occur to him that it was neat. He did it because he had worked out that it was the plain thing, which is what he does, which is what he has always done, and which is the only reason any of it ever worked at all. The second house has been open 4 years now and I will put down what it looks like, because the shape of it is the only argument I have left for any of this. There is no box, there is no vault, no reserve, no metal at all in the building, and Perrin's old block sits in the middle of the room where anybody walking past can see the whole of the operation in one glance. We buy naming forward and we sell it on. A household in Dre gives the naming for Bevan for 4 years and takes a coin today. A mountain that wants those 4 years pays for them, the coin moves between them, and the only thing standing behind it is that everybody in 9 towns has watched us pay for 6 years without once being short, which is exactly what was standing behind the first house. The gold was never doing anything. It took me 9 years, a run, and losing everything to find that out, and I have stopped pretending the gold was ever the point. Hask does the walk still. He is 60 and he refuses to hand it to Eno, and last autumn it took him 6 days. And he came into the yard at the end of it and put his boots on my table without being invited, which is the only thing he has ever done that I would call affection. 6 days. It was 9 when I was a boy and 1 afternoon when I was 38, and that number is the only monument this business is ever going to get. Sarn came back in the 2nd spring. He walked up from the lower valleys with nothing, and he stood in the yard, and he used more words in that hour than in the 4 years before it. He wanted work. Does the house hold anything against me for leaving? Nothing was held against him. He rings metal for Umber now, on the days when there is metal to ring, and he is better at it than she is, which she says freely and which annoys her enormously. Tak has an interest in the split ladle, which he won in an argument, and which the potman still runs, and the 2 of them have been conducting the same dispute for 6 years to the great enjoyment of the whole town. The dispute is whether a creature who cannot get drunk should pay full price for beer. Tak's position is that he is paying for the company. The potman's position, delivered at volume every 9th day, is that Tak has never bought company in his life. Tak's answer to that is a demonstration, and the demonstration involves standing up, and there are 4 women on Kettle Row who will tell you they have seen it and 2 who will tell you they have not and are not sorry about it. Merritt employs 12 people, including Peg Ever, who cuts better than she does and has been told so, and no longer takes coats in trade. Rel runs the couriers, 9 of them, on the 9-day post from Hollis to Cairo, and has not been in a room with Fitch since he came back from the Larn workings, and Fitch's daughters go and see him. Bram Aubryn married St. Ever from the Embry Yard, which nobody expected, least of all the widow, who attended and said one word about it afterward and then never said another. The weighing took the mark in the 3rd year. Hesper Bly wrote to me herself, 4 lines, and the 4th line was that a promise which had survived being called was worth more than a promise which had never been tested, and that they had waited to see it happen before they would touch it. There are 4 houses now, ours, and Urin's in Dre, and the Sallow house at Hollis, run by a woman called Sab who bought her building from Osric 10 years ago and has never once let anybody forget it, and the Bell house in Cairo, which Ansel Roque runs and which Doran will not discuss. We honor each other without a ceiling, which is the arrangement that killed the first house, and we do it because it is still the only arrangement that works, and because every one of us now knows exactly what it costs and has said so out where the others can hear. Of Osric I know one thing, from a brass man of Ansel Roque's who saw him at a fair in the South 2 winters ago. He is still in our shape. He is still perfectly courteous. He keeps a warehouse at Farrant, down where the water is warm, with 19,000 pieces of stamped gold in it, and he has never sold one, and nobody at that fair could tell you his name. Urin took the first of the new claims, knowing exactly what was behind it, which was nothing. She is the largest holder in the second house and she has never once come to look at a box, because there is no box. Vask applied. Umber refused him, in her own words, at length, and I was in the yard for it. She let him get all the way to the end of the speech about how he had been in the house from the beginning, and then she gave it to him in the voice she keeps for weighing. You are not clean and you never were. The only honest thing about you is what is under that coat, and I have seen that as well, and it did not impress me either. Vask wanted to know, with real dignity, whether he might have the decision in writing. He got it in chalk on the low gate, in Tibbs' youngest's hand, with a drawing, and the rain did not take it off for 8 days. He applied again the following year and she refused him again, at greater length. Which leaves the mountain. The Syrian paid 9,000 coins into a lane in tallow on the strength of a promise, and that promise still stands, and there are years of it left in the coin that Osric took south, dead in his hand along with everything else. So the guarantee died with the old house. Her word was discharged, her count was down by 9,000, and by every arrangement that had ever been written between us she owed me nothing at all. I could have left it there. That is the ending most people would have chosen, and it would have been decent, and I have never once been able to explain properly why I did not. What I did instead was write the guarantee again, 1 line, exactly as before. Greaves stands behind the mark. Same words, same freely, same coin, struck by Doran on the same block. And then I gave it away. Not to myself. The second house does not hold it and I have never held it. It went to Umber, in her own name, to be held for the Scree and for the 640 in the lower valleys, the ones the Syrian bought with cattle in a hard winter and the one she left on a rock heap for 400 years before that. They are the creditor now. Not me. If the mark fails, Grieve pays, and Grieve pays to them. She agreed to it, and nobody believes that. She stood in the road above her own town and gave the words in daylight with N.O. holding the coin, and she did it for the same reason she did everything, which is that she had done the arithmetic and it came out. Because the naming under Grieve is worth 4 times what it was when a man on Sixpence Lane counted 11 closed doors, and every mouth of it is on that heap and in those valleys, and the day they stop she is a mountain with dust on it. She is not free. I want to be exact about that, because it has been told kindly and it should not be. The largest creature on this continent gets up every morning and finds out whether she is still solvent to 900 people who own nothing, and she cannot leave, because leaving is failing and failing is the thing she has promised to pay for. She could have refused. She read every line. She has never once said I tricked her, and the only thing she has ever said about it, in the few times we have spoken since, is that she should have looked at the bad part instead of the size of the good part. I see her about twice a year. It is not friendship. She still calls me the counting man and she still will not sit down in tallow. Last autumn she came down for the 9th day, and Hask did the walk, and it took him 6 days, because there are a great many more doors than there used to be. We are in the vein again. The ceiling is mended, badly, by Tak, who owns a hill and a great deal of opinion about carpentry. He did it in his own shape, which meant the hole had to be made bigger before it could be made smaller, and Umber priced the view from underneath at a penny, and then reckoned she had overpaid. Kel holds the door most mornings, which he does not have to do, and which he has been offered money not to do by two separate houses in Caro. And the first coin of the second house sits on a nail over the block where anybody can take it. The town calls it the nail and has done since the first week, because it is worth exactly nothing and everybody in this town knows it. I struck it myself with a borrowed hammer on a wet morning with no gold in the building. 9 strokes on one face, and on the other, small, the 4 words I have not improved on since. Say it and it counts.
This story is worth watching because it takes the oldest fantasy in the world, a mountain of gold that nobody can spend, and asks the one question nobody in 10,000 years thought to ask, which is who exactly decides that the gold is yours. It is about a bankrupt man who counts what everybody else remembers, a queen who measures a risk in centuries when it arrives in days, and a debt that does not end when it is paid. If you enjoy stories about strategy, leverage, money, quiet revenge, and the long consequences of one clever arrangement, stay with the channel and come back for the next one.